Now that we have a quorum present, I'd like to open the meeting of November 13th, 2008 of the Planning Commission for the City of Santa Barbara. Ms. Rodriguez, could you please take the roll?
Commissioner Bartlett. Commissioner Jacobs. Commissioner Jostes.
Here.
Commissioner Thompson. Here. Commissioner White. Here. Vice Chair Larson.
Here.
Chair Myers. Absent.
All right, that's right. Next move is me. Sorry about that. I'm here. I was waiting for somebody to kick in, and it's me. So any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items?
Chair Larson, staff has no changes for today's agenda.
Okay, thank you very much. Any announcement and appeals?
I have an announcement regarding the City Council meeting this last Tuesday. The Council considered recommendations from the staff and the Finance Committee as to the next implementing steps for the Upper State Street program. The recommendation was based on prior discussions with the Finance Committee where 4 options were presented in terms of how to proceed. I think we have reported to the Commission that the outcome of the Finance Committee in October was to recommend this option 4, which was to take a simplified approach with the guidelines to extract from the Upper State Street study the key policy directives and frame them as guidelines which could be adopted rather quickly and then used more effectively by the ABR and Planning Commission staff and applicants. So that recommendation actually was supported by the Council, and so we have been directed to move forward regarding the simplified guidelines. However, I'm not sure if any of you caught the meeting or have heard any parts of it. It ended up being a fairly extensive discussion again on the part of the Council in terms of their interest in studying transit along the Upper State Street corridor. And many of the Council members are still concerned about how much information we know, what options may be presented in the future in terms of looking at projects there, as well as a major potentially capital investments for perhaps dedicated transit or other transit facilities enhancements. So the action of the Council was a 2-part action: 1, to provide us direction to do the guidelines, and then 2, to return to discuss with the Council more information about a less costly focused study that could begin to look at transit issues in the Upper State Street corridor. So staff of Public Works and Community Development will be putting our heads together again and getting back to Council. And it was an undefined period of time. They said a reasonably short period of time, but once we have more information to present.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Weiss. And at this point, we can take public comment from anyone on any subject not on our agenda. So that would be not on Plan Santa Barbara for up to 2 minutes. So is there anyone who needs to speak to something not on the agenda? Seeing no one here for that, I'll close the public comment. And we do want to welcome, put your hands up so we can all see who you are, from UCSB. Whoa, look at that. This will make the meeting shorter. I thought they were all here for public comment. Anyway, welcome. Welcome. We'll try and keep you awake. These nice students are from Bob Wilkerson's Environmental Studies class. So welcome to Santa Barbara's Planning Commission. And I know when you get tired, you'll drift out the door, but we understand. Thank you. So this brings us to the part of our agenda. And do we have agendas in the back of the room for the students that might? Okay, good. So feel free to take agendas if you need them, or, you know, the green slips are for public comment. If anybody needs that information too, make sure your cell phones are off. This is all for the students, you know. All right, so now we are at what we came to do, the action item today, Plan Santa Barbara, General Plan Framework at the revised draft policy preferences, and we have a presentation from staff. And I am going to request that we stick to the topic so we don't wander far afield as we go down the line here. Okay, so Ms. Weiss and Mr. Ledbetter.
Yes, thank you, Chair Larson. I'll provide some preliminary comments and then turn the presentation over to John Ledbetter. I just want to start by saying that the public input and Planning Commission input into developing the Plan Santa Barbara policy preferences and general plan framework has been top-notch. This last year at Plus has been really incredible in terms of how much quality input we've had, dedication of people's time and energy into shaping what we have before us today. This more recently includes the series of special meetings that the Planning Commission had in September, where on September 10th we held a public hearing. Members of the public organizations were provided the opportunity to present extensive presentations to the Commission on the full range of issues that we're looking at in the Plan Santa Barbara process. Then on September 11th and 25th, the Planning Commission did a very detailed review of the proposed draft policy preferences, as well as the framework of our general plan as it's taking shape in this process. The Planning Commission input, again, extensive, incredible, and really, really important input. At the close of the Planning Commission hearing on September 25th, I think we were almost there. Everyone was feeling that was quite a bit of input, and what the task was given to staff is take all that has occurred through this series of meetings and the input prior and redraft the document for our review. So this meeting today was intended for an important once-over review on the part of the Commission to see that the staff got it right, that we heard this input. And the input, as John will demonstrate, has really taken the document, this proposed policy preferences and framework, to the next level. It is continually, it's just so rewarding to see how the whole Plan Santa Barbara process really is moving along the dialogue and understanding of these key issues. And of course, the key issues, again, which Mr. Ledbetter will overview in terms of the growth management for our community's character, sustainability, and environmental concerns, and a whole host of very important interrelated issues. So today we are here with the Planning Commission to provide you with an overview of the changes and seek your recommendation to the City Council. Our desired outcome today is to work with the Planning Commission towards a unanimous consensus type of recommendation. We think that that would be really what I think we've all been working towards. However, we recognize that there are some areas where, given the range of community interest and opinion on some of these very important topics, there may be the desire on the part of the Commission to have some straw specific votes or comments specifically that you'd like to see forwarded. And we think that that still will work within the concept of moving forward with a unanimous recommendation. So we will be making a staff presentation, and then you'll be hearing from the public. And we're here to assist the Commission in your discussion, provide any additional input, and help in shaping recommendations as necessary, so that we may move on to the City Council in December, where Council would be receiving the recommendations from the Commission, the staff, and additional public input, and the Council can provide this important direction for our next phase. I think it's we try to emphasize this for people's understanding of Plan Santa Barbara because it is a multi-phase process. We are at a very important point with the Planning Commission's recommendation on the draft policies, as well as beginning to explore what alternatives will be examined in the EIR. And the Council action to move that forward into a draft EIR and into the draft land use element and draft housing element is, we believe we're ready. We're well prepared. This has been excellent work. We do want people to understand that this isn't a adoption or decision phase. Again, we are making a series of important actions and decisions along the way, yet this is not the final decision. This is the decision of the Planning Commission to make its recommendations for this phase of the Plan Santa Barbara process. So with that, I'll turn it over to John Ledbetter, and he'll walk you through the proposal.
Thank you, Ms. Weiss. Mr. Ledbetter?
Thank you, Chair Larson, members of the Planning Commission, and thank you for the introductory remarks, Ms. Weiss. The agenda for my presentation here is to go over a few of the key components that comprise Plan Santa Barbara as it's drafted today, a quick overview of some of the key revisions in this document, and then we'll open it up to, at the Commission's desire, open it up to public hearing, and then finally look forward to the deliberations of the Planning Commission on your recommendations on the report itself. Key components here of Plan Santa Barbara at this point are the sustainability framework, which includes the definition and the principles, and also the relationship of this document and this set of policies to the general plan update process. And I'll get into that in just a moment here, as well as the content of the goals, objectives, and policies. And lastly, the other key component is our adaptive management program. Our overview looks at a number of items, and what we don't look at in a lot of detail are your general comments, a lot of the smaller edits, and some of the format changes that have gone into this document, some of which are quite significant, but we don't feel like we'll spend a lot of time on them. Specifically, one good example of that is the reformatting of the community design chapter to give greater emphasis to historic resources. We heard that message loud and clear from both the community and the Commission, and so you see that reflected in this document. But I'm not going to get into a lot of discussion on that this afternoon. The forward to the document is new to help explain what that relationship is between Plan Santa Barbara and the general plan update process, and a number of items in the introduction itself. All of the objectives are new. This is something that you've asked us to include into the document, and we feel like this is really added to the document, particularly as it interfaces with the adaptive management program. And then the growth management policies are the ones that we've really spent a lot of time on refining and honing those in conjunction with the environmental analysis alternatives. And then the mobility-oriented development area, the MODA, we've spent some time on that as well, fleshing that out and giving some more life to it in a graphic way on our map. And then finally, the maps in general, including the 4 informational maps now that really are a disaggregation of the one single map we had before. And then I'll provide you with an update where we are on the land use map itself. It's so important that people understand what the relationship is of Plan Santa Barbara to the general plan update process. And one of the misconceptions that we've had over the last couple of months have been, well, what is that relationship, and where do we stand in terms of the existing general plan policies vis-a-vis the ones that are being proposed here? And we think that it's important that the community understand, particularly this was raised with historic resources. It was raised recently, most recently with view preservation policies, and then MTD has recently asked me about the circulation policies. And the question keeps coming up is, well, are those policies still there? Are they, how come they're not included in Plan Santa Barbara? And the idea is all these policies in the existing general plan are still in place and valid. And what you'll see is through this phase 2, what we're doing is very additive in terms of providing a sustainability, an overarching sustainability framework for all of our policies, as well as these new ones that we specifically included under Plan Santa Barbara. So that's an important point. And of course, there's graphics to illustrate that, as I've just shown. Phase 3 here, which will begin in earnest at the beginning of next year, is really takes what we've done, we've achieved with this document, and begins to work on the outputs, the actual land use element, the housing element, the adaptive management program, as well as the final land use map, and of course the environmental impact report. And then those are the concrete products that come out of this process, as well as the overall framework of the organization of the future elements that we'll see in the next phase. The introduction, we didn't do much to the history, only to note that that'll be expanded as we move into the next phase of work. However, we did a significant amount of work on the conditions, the discussion of the conditions, trends, and issues, the key issues, and the reoccurring themes, and how those interface with the policy drivers, how they've evolved, if you will, through this process, and how those issues affect what's being proposed for the principles and in the policies themselves. It's really a discussion about what are the implications of these key issues and recurring themes if we continue with business as usual and don't make some significant changes. The sustainability framework, here we've added one new policy driver at the request of a number of the community members, as well as the council when we last met with a work session with the Planning Commission and the council. Historic resources, you'll find that has a much greater emphasis now in the sustainability emphasis, in the sustainability framework. And the adaptive management discussion and policies have also been strengthened. And here again you see that this is the chart that we've used, and we've added public health here. Otherwise, this remains essentially the same with the adaptive management program as our key feedback mechanism. Now, in terms of growth management policies, these have been retooled based on the discussion of the extensive discussion we've had throughout all the last 3 Planning Commission meetings, as well as input from the City Attorney's Office. I think it's instructive for me to read to you what we have, how we've described these in the staff report. I think it's important that the words be carefully selected here. So for LG1, what we do is this policy seeks to establish the priority for future resource capacity allocations for additional growth to affordable housing development over all other types of development. LG2 would extend existing Charter Section 1508 policies, otherwise known as Measure E, our non-residential growth cap, to the year 2030 by limiting net new non-residential development to the remaining unbuilt Measure E square footage. Policies would also be extended for separate square footage provisions for minor additions, redevelopment of existing non-residential square footage, and sphere of area annexations. Timely monitoring and adaptive management are required. And then finally, for LG3, this policy would provide for future residential growth and was revised here to provide broad policy language to balance between the objectives of living within our resources and of meeting California requirements and regulations for general plan housing element updates. The revised language does not establish a specific limit on the number of future residential units, which provides flexibility in how these objectives may best be balanced. Provisions are included for monitoring and adaptive management, just like with LG2, to further ensure there are sufficient resource capacities to support future residential development. So I think that these have been worded very carefully, and it's also important to understand what are some of these important considerations, other important considerations when we're looking at residential development, and those are really a broad policy approach, our EIR impact analysis, and the housing element provisions. All 3 of those need to be considered as we finalize this language. So looking at some of the broad policies, implications here, again, giving residential development the priority here in all of our overall development, and then limiting non-residential to allow for economic vitality, community needs, and to improve our jobs housing balance. So they're fashioned in that context. And then finally, the resource constraints are really key to making these work. And understanding what the resource constraints are and monitoring those and having some sort of ability to make adjustments as we progress through the planning period. And finally, there is no specific number here in this particular policy, LG3, in order to explicitly avoid policy conflicts, and those being with the housing element provisions. And I think, as most people know at this point, through the RHNA housing needs allocation process, we have been given our fair share of housing of 4,388 units. And so the question is, how do we grapple with that, and how do we deal with that as part of this policy development? And clearly, we have the zoning capacity now to meet that number. And I think that's been illustrated a number of times, as we began with our development trends. And, it's illustrated in our map here. You look at all the blue parcels here. We certainly do have the capacity at this point to meet that. But the other key component of it that the HCD, that the State Housing and Community Development Department looks at, is what are the housing constraints to achieving this number? And we feel that we can demonstrate that that we can achieve this number, but within the limits, if you will, of our resource constraints. And here, particularly, we pay a lot of attention to our water and our sewer constraints, because these really are not policy-driven, but these are resource-based. And again, that's why we think that the adaptive management and monitoring our resources where we are every step of the way is so important to making this policy package effective and viable. And then thirdly, the other residential development consideration that we'd like you to mull over as you're looking at this are what we feel are realistic projections for future residential development based on both policy and market influences. What we've proposed here, we've gone back to looking at a likely build-out number of 2,800 residential units under both the no project and the project alternatives, because we feel like this is the historic trend that we've seen, and the real difference is going to be on what the policies affect. What are the effects of the Plan Santa Barbara policies on existing business as usual policies? So in other words, these policies would focus on the type, the location, the size, and the design of the types of residential units, and not necessarily on the rate or the number of those units. And that would be considered under the two other alternatives. So just to remind you again what this next increment of growth, to put that into context, what we have on the ground today in terms of non-residential square footage is a little bit over 21 million square feet. What we have on the ground today in terms of residential units are a little bit over 37,400 units. So what we're looking at in terms of this next increment, and what will be studied in the EIR, will be for non-residential this range between 1.5 million to 3 million square feet, and for residential units between 2,000 and 7,000 units. And we feel that this captures the next increment of growth, and that it's so critical for us to move on to the next phase where we can actually look at what the impact of this amount of growth will be given various different sets of policies. So the changes in the set of draft EIR alternatives at this point are, for sake of clarity, we've separated out the non-residential square footages between Measure-E and non-Measure-E. And as I mentioned earlier, non-Measure-E means minor additions, redeveloped square footage, and annexations. And so those are typically not counted as part of Measure-E. And then I mentioned also the unit number. We've gone back to the historic projection of 2,800 units, both for the no project and the project alternatives. Very quickly, the range of policy alternatives we're looking at: the no project alternative, essentially taking forward the existing policies. The project alternative would be the Plan Santa Barbara set of policies. Alternative one would be a set of policies that would produce a lower amount of growth, particularly for residential units. Alternative three would be a more aggressive approach towards trying to right the jobs housing balance with a higher number of residential units. And then finally, the long-range full build-out would be the maximum of 3 million square feet and 7,000 units, which would occur. We don't anticipate that to occur during this planning period, but that would be the ultimate capacity build-out. So moving on now to the mobility-oriented development area, or MODA. Here are a few points that we feel help to better explain what exactly the MODA is trying to achieve and what the objectives are. Primarily to improve connectivity, to get beyond just the automobile, to look at how we improve walkability, bicycling, and transit. This also helps to enhance placemaking and civic engagement, all of which we think are important values, if you will, that we've heard throughout this process of what constitutes the community in Santa Barbara here. Also, explicit land use and circulation policy connections identified through transit nodes within this MODA area gives it real focus along the principal transit lines and particularly a dedicated transit line we've identified. Increasing mobility through targeted capital improvements and through our transit planning. Again, being much more strategic and surgical, if you will, in terms of how we want to go about doing this. And then targeting more workforce housing and smaller units within this area, and revising our parking standards. Here's the map that illustrates that. You see the purple line, the boundary of the location of the transit nodes, and the principal spine, if you will, runs up State Street, jogs over at Mission, goes up De La Vina, and then back onto Upper State Street here. And each one of these transit nodes signifies a quarter-mile walking distance between quarter-mile walking distance of the radius. Very quickly, the maps. These essentially, we took the one map that in the last document and disaggregated that out into 4 different maps. You've seen the potential growth locations quickly earlier on. The MODA map we just reviewed. The potential neighborhood districts map. This is really a starting point for the discussions as we move into phase 3 and we update our land use element that has very detailed descriptions of our neighborhoods. And this is also meant to be a catalyst, if you will, to begin discussions of our sustainable neighborhood planning. And again, I think as you know, the community is very interested in neighborhood planning, and there's been some spontaneous planning efforts, if you will, both up on the Mesa and most recently on the Upper East Side, where the community is getting together and looking at how their neighborhood functions, how they can make that more sustainable. So we're very excited that the community is taking a very proactive role in neighborhood planning, and we look forward to this being an important part of our work program next year. And then finally, the potential secondary units locations, and a very simple map just shows where second units would be encouraged in the single-family areas within the MOTA boundary, as well as where outside of the MOTA where they would be allowed, and then finally in this pinker area up in the high fire elevations where second units would be restricted. Finally, in terms of maps, the land use map, we did meet with the planning subcommittee and looked at a number of different land use maps, or they're often referred to as diagrams, to look at some examples, cutting-edge examples of what other communities are doing today. And as would probably be no surprise to anyone, just about everybody is digitizing and putting their land use maps on the GIS. So we've initiated that. That portion of the work is almost complete. We'll then be moving into correcting the map, making corrections from the old map, and adding past general plan amendments, doing a zoning district overlay to look for any areas of conflict. And then we'll bring a draft back to you in the beginning of January for your review, and that that land use plan will then be included as part of the EIR scoping meeting at the end of January. So just to conclude my remarks here, this report is scheduled to be heard by the council next month on December 11th and 16th. Our land use map and work program discussion will come back to you January 8th. And then finally, the EIR scoping meeting will be also here before you, and that'll occur on January 22nd. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ledbetter. Now, questions from the commission for our staff. Ms. Jacobs?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ledbetter, I have a question about the map and the that shows secondary unit locations, and the detail that is not on there is that this is single zoning that's currently single family that would be encouraged or otherwise have secondary units, because what's white otherwise in here is multifamily or commercial. Is that right?
Chair Larson and Commissioner Jacobs, that is absolutely correct. This map is the emphasis, all the colored areas are single family, so they would either be encouraged within the MOTA, they'd be allowed in the yellow portions, or they would be strongly restricted in the pink areas.
Could we indicate in the legend then that it's single family zoned areas? I don't think it says it really clearly.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, I have a quick one, which on the same vein, I would like to ask, because I know that the street I live on has secondary dwelling units, but they're not noted, and it's in an area where it wouldn't be permitted. I think it'd be very helpful in this if we knew where the permitted secondary dwelling units are, because perhaps there are some areas within these that are already accommodating secondary dwelling units that we should look at. And any other questions? All right, I'll open the public hearing then, and we have many speaker slips, and we have a nice lot of written material too, which I will say for myself is very hard to go through at the meeting. So if I haven't received it before the meeting, it probably won't get the attention that I wish it could have received. However, I'm going to ask you to, if you are an individual speaking, please keep your comments to 2 minutes, and I'm pretty stiff about that. And if you're speaking for a whole lot of people, 3 to 4. All righty, unless someone relinquishes their time to you. So that being said, let's start with Judy Orias, please, from Allied Neighbors.
I'm Judy Arias. I'm president of the Allied Neighborhood Associations. You have a document which we submitted to the staff to distribute to you, I believe, the day before yesterday. We have a statement that was approved by the association. This involves 12 residential associations across the city of Santa Barbara. The primary object of our concern are the recommendations for the accommodating of the new population growth in the city by means of substantial and dense compact housing developments to be located within the city core in the proximity to alternative transit. The recommended proposals derive from a popular smart growth model. The problem is, for the model to work and deliver on its promise, far more growth and higher population densities as well as affordable housing is required that can be constructed in the city. The limitation upon our potential for development and creation of new affordable housing is primarily the result of the price of real estate here due to the area's attractiveness and the limitations of the available resources. No study to date has been devoted to the question of whether the proposal will in fact work. Our conclusion is that the risk of these proposals not working, the adverse effect upon the city, far outweigh the potential benefits. We should remember that in 1975, the voters overwhelmingly passed an advisory ballot measure, A2, which called for the public votes on policies that potentially influence growth. That ballot box mandate has never been rescinded. Let's give the citizens a vote that they deserve, a ballot box vote on any general plan revisions that affect growth. The Allied Neighborhood Association also found that this plan pushes housing density increases at any cost without any clear information of the facts or its increase is necessary or in the best interest of the city. There are conflicts between proposed policies in this document. The policies that are designed to eliminate a significant portion of the single-family neighborhoods. There's questions about the Euclidean land use patterns. It fails to recognize the desire for families today is to have a single-family house with a yard, and people will continue to move to where they can go and get that. Smart growth is a regional program that does not work in small cities such as ours. The population a proposal to turn roads into two lanes is also a very serious concern to us. Many of the policies in this document require funding which is currently not in the city budget. The public needs to know what the financial cost as well as the quality of life will be to them. Under the EIR and the feasibility study, the cost to the residents must be identified accurately. Growth management policies on page 28, staff report of November 3rd, 2008, note that it was suggested 1 million square feet in non-residential growth. The chart at the end of the staff report does not study this option. Instead, there are 3 levels that study 1.5 million square feet. Our association requests that the 1 million square feet option be studied. Also, there is concerns about the fact that Mission Creek is not considered in the review of the flooding problem, yet that is the major flooding area in our city. And there is also very serious concerns about the differences between the maps in the Santa Barbara General Trends and Update map and the planned Santa Barbara map. Do you want me to do Hidden Valley now?
I was just going to say, you're on a roll. Judy Arias, followed by Judy Arias.
I'm Secretary of Hidden Valley.
To be followed by Sheila Lodge.
Yeah. And we had a meeting of the board of directors yesterday, and they went over the maps that I just spoke to you about, and they note that Hidden Valley is now allowed to have secondary units. They are very, very, very concerned about this, and the reasons are that we have a large number of retired homes in the area, Val Verde, Vista Del Monte, with hospitals that people have to get out. We are tied in by Modoc Road and Las Positas, and if you will recall with the last 2 incidences on the freeway, we could not get out. Our lots are 7,500 square feet, which is the smallest single-family lots. They are single-family lots, and we have a fairly large family population in the area. We have a fire danger, which is not identified in the map. The Painted Cave fire was 20 minutes from burning my house. We all had to evacuate. So the board of directors are requesting that the Hidden Valley area be removed from the a possible second units. They do not feel that it is appropriate to be in this area. There are too many traffic constraints, and the ability of all of us to get out is virtually impossible in a situation such as we've had. Also, we're in a floodplain, and let me see, is there anything else? That's it. Thank you very much, and I think I was under the time.
For two, you did it. Good delivery. So Sheila Lodge, followed by Dr. Paul Hernati.
Good afternoon, Chair Larson and members of the Planning Commission. I'm Sheila Lodge, speaking today as Chair of the General Plan Update Committee of Citizens Planning Association. Let me assure you at the outset that we support many of staff's draft policy preferences aiming to ensure sustainability, but we miss a clear reaffirmation of the city charter's core principle of, quote, living within our resources, unquote, as the minimum requirement for sustaining what we have now for generations to come. In three brief statements, two of my colleagues and I will address three large topics. One, commercial and residential growth. Two, historical and aesthetic resources. And three, environmental and economic sustainability. I will speak to the first two. Paul Hernati and Mary Louise Days will speak to the third. And please note we're summarizing a longer letter that we submitted on Monday for your consideration. The commercial and residential growth, almost any commercial growth, will increase the number of commuting employees, and the city's commuting workforce would be further increased by the service needs of those purchasing newly built market-rate housing units. Therefore, we recommend that the Measure E restrictions be renewed and that residential growth be capped at about 40,005 dwelling units to result in about 1 million square feet of new non-residential development and about 2,000 new residential units in the next 20 years. Our proposed numbers are lower than the numbers proposed by staff for thorough analysis in the project EIR because we believe, and actually the 1 million square feet is not proposed for analysis at all, Santa Barbara doesn't need any more market rate housing. What we do need is more affordable housing for workforce to buy or rent, and a certain amount of non-residential development offering distinct community benefits. Under historical and aesthetic resources, we are disappointed by the lack of detail in the policies proposed for the appreciation and preservation of historical resources. Santa Barbara has a rich historic legacy. Current goals and policies call for its protection and preservation. Any new ones should be at least as strong and elaborate on what is already outlined in existing documents. Likewise, the proposed policies concerning aesthetics and visual resources take good steps toward worthy goals without sufficient clarification of significant details. It should be explicitly stated, for example, that new developments shall preserve public scenic views. New development should maintain or, if possible, enhance the existing degree of openness, naturalness, and relative lack of congestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll have Paul Hernati, followed by Mary Louise Days.
Good afternoon, Chair Larson and Commissioners. I am Paul Hernati, the second of three speakers for CPA's General Plan Update Committee, and I will briefly address air quality and energy conservation. Regarding air quality, we are pleased with the proposed policy that calls for a 500-foot setback from Highway 101 and for funding a program to monitor emission levels and identify a more refined setback line. But we remain concerned about the lack of site-specific monitoring in those parts of the proposed mobility-oriented development area which lie further away from the highway. The siting of residential buildings near heavy stop-and-go traffic should not be advocated on the assumption that increasing urban density would decrease air pollution. To the contrary, and I quote from Urban Sprawl and Public Health, a book co-authored by the prominent environmental scientists Howard Fromkin, Lawrence Frank, and Richard Jackson. On a very localized scale, they write, alongside a street in a particular neighborhood, greater traffic density could increase exposure to pollutants, especially particulate matter and air toxics. One study, they continue, found that people who live near busy streets, defined as carrying more than 10,000 vehicles per day, Upper State Street of course carries more than 30,000, that those people were exposed to 2 to 3-fold higher levels of black smoke, a measure of particulate matter, nitrogen oxide, and carbon monoxide, compared to people who live near a less busy street. This is the end of quote. Given the proven impact of traffic-generated air pollution on public health, especially on children and the elderly. A responsible land use plan for our downtown and other commercial areas should include the monitoring of their air quality so that the safe distance of residential developments from particular traffic corridors can be established. As for staff's preferred climate change and energy conservation policies, we applaud many, but wish to caution about some proposed policies which we find counterproductive. I conclude with just two examples. Draft policy H14 offers a questionable incentive for the densification of single-family zones when it proposes to allow just one electric, gas and water meter for the main residence and the second unit. Beyond any doubt, sharing meters would prove conducive to the wasteful consumption of precious resources. Draft policy ER37 in turn proposes to raise the maximum outdoor noise standard for residential land uses in commercial zones from
15 seconds, I hate to tell you, but you're there.
I think I'll be probably finished. Draft policy the noise standards, these relaxed noise standards would clearly increase future energy consumption because many more units would be built whose residents would feel constrained to keep their windows closed and their air conditioners turned on. Here I stop to leave time for our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernati. Mary Louise Days, followed by Steve Moss.
I am Mary Louise Days, the third and final speaker for CPA's General Plan Update Committee. In line with our other concerns about environmental sustainability, we object to draft policy CH10 because it favors retaining a 60-foot height limit for the downtown area. In addition to protecting Santa Barbara's cherished small-town feel, lower ceilings and 40 to 45-foot building height limits would reduce the material and energy needs for construction, heating, cooling, and elevator use. Also, a popular initiative to lower the 60-foot height limit will be before the voters of Santa Barbara next November. The city ought not to have a policy preference which is less sustainable than the policy preference that may soon be embraced by the majority of citizens. A few more words about economic sustainability. The first objective in the Economy and Fiscal Health chapter of the report enumerates some major components of the city's economic sector as follows: tourism, retail, health, and education. We are puzzled why two very important elements of the city's economy, retirement income and high-tech industry, are not listed. And I remember way back when properties and pensions ranked just about highest in our local income. To retain all potential major sources of revenue, the city must remain competitive with other attractive locations by protecting and enhancing the qualities that make Santa Barbara desirable for workers, entrepreneurs, tourists, and retirees alike. In this respect, public safety should be an important consideration too, and the environmental analysis for Plan Santa Barbara should explore whether our police and fire departments are adequately staffed and equipped for a city whose daytime population, local residents plus commuters and tourists, is significantly larger than the 90,473 people who live here. According to the Conditions, Trends, and Issues report of 3 years ago, the daily influx of our non-resident population oscillates between 40,000 and 100,000 people. To conclude, our committee especially welcomes those draft policy preferences which promote living within our resources well into the foreseeable future, and also show credible promise to improve our jobs-housing balance. By contrast, we hope that policy preferences inimical to those overarching goals will be modified or abandoned in subsequent phases of the Plan Santa Barbara process. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much, Ms. Days. Steve Moss, followed by Gil Berry. Thank you for everyone for your consideration for the time.
Good afternoon, Chair Larson and Commissioners. I'm Steve Moss, representing Santa Barbara Metropolitan Transit District. You have in front of you a letter from General Manager Sherry Fisher, who could not be here today and sent me in her stead. I wanted to say first we want to thank the City and the Commission for giving us this chance to comment on the draft policy preferences. We're very supportive of the many innovative elements in the draft policy preferences, such as the mobility-oriented development area, the sustainable neighborhood plans, seems like a great idea as well, And we appreciate that the city is supporting efforts to expand California's Yield to Bus program, which currently by state law is limited to 2 counties, Santa Cruz and Santa Clara. And it would be great if we had the option in this county of passing such a requirement so that it would allow buses to pull back into traffic without having to wait for all the cars. We also support the goal of a 50-50 mode share. That's a very ambitious goal. We'd love to see it happen between the private automobile and all other modes. And finally, we really appreciate that MTD's public transit service throughout the document is recognized as a very important element of the transportation infrastructure in the city. We're very appreciative of that. And as you know, any improvements to transit will require additional public subsidy, which we just want to make sure that people are aware of that as well. The circulation section of the policy includes a policy calling for regional coordination to establish viable regional commuter options. We support that and also support coordination amongst MTD, the city, and the other agencies in the area for local transit as well. And finally, we support the fact that the circulation section of the draft policy preferences will be incorporated into the existing circulation element of the general plan, which is already, we think, a real good document in supporting all modes of travel. And we think the proposed additions will be a very good one. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. Connie Hanna, please, followed by Kathy McCammon.
Good afternoon, Planning Commissioners. My name is Gil Berry. I'm a member of the Allied Neighborhoods Association. I feel that staff's recommendation to not say much about the rate of growth and number of growth might have had a lot to do with dealing with the RHNA number. And I noticed there was a lot of struggle at your last meeting on this issue, so I gave it a lot of thought and I came up with an idea of how to handle that. And the idea I came up with was to have in our general plan 2 time periods, a short-term time period or short-range time period of 20 years and a long-range time period of 40 years, which would go to 2050. And on the long-range time period of 2050, we would accommodate the 4,388 RHNA number, and we would also have our resources spread out to the long term of the 40-year to 2050. And a main principle of sustainability is not to use up 100% of our resource capacity, but to leave some resource capacity for our children and future generations. This means we don't want to grow so much in the next 20 years as to use up 100% of our water, sewer, and our street capacity. And for example, if our water capacity was, say, 5,000 units, instead of using 5,000 units as the maximum that we could grow in the 2030, it might make more sense to say, well, if we have 5,000 units, let's spread it out to 2050. Then we use 2,500 during the first 20 years and 2,500 during the second 20 years. So we save some of our resources for the future. And that it also allows us to meet the RHNA numbers by having our zoning capacity be such that it goes out to the long term, 2050. There's nothing that says we have to have our zoning capacity matched at 2030. So that is a way to accommodate the RHNA number issue without having to be silent on rate and number. I feel that rate and number are very essential to our plan. And lastly, I wanted to say that, changing the subject, on the subject of housing affordability, to improve our current jobs housing imbalance, it is necessary to set our Measure E at 1 million square feet over the next 20-year planning period. The reason for this is even though because the previous Measure E was 3 million, we only used 1.5 million over the last 20 years. And this 1.5 million resulted in a lot more new jobs than housing units built.
Got 15 seconds.
Caused a huge increase in the number of commuters. To continue with the same 1.5 million non-residential square feet is to continue the same thing we did the last 20 years, which didn't work. So we definitely need to revise both the project and the slower growth alternative policy 1 down to 1 million square feet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Kathy McCammon, followed by Debbie Cox-Bolten. I'm sorry. I was shuffling these cards too fast. Connie Hanna. Let's get this right. Followed by Kathy McCammon.
Okay,
then
thanks.
followed by Debbie Cox-Bolton. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Connie Hanna, First Vice President for the League of Women Voters. There are several things that we want to support in this revision. First, we want to congratulate you for readopting Measure E. We think that it will be just as important in the next 20 years as it has been in the past 20. We have not previously said that we appreciate the addition of sustainability to the plan. Unfortunately, we know that you are aware that different people interpret sustainability quite differently. The League believes that less overall development is necessarily more sustainable over the long run in order to live within our resources. We understand the compromise that led to putting no specific number of dwelling units in the plan, although we preferred the 2,000 figure. We plan to support either the project or alternative one in the future, but none of the higher numbers. We especially want to support your adaptive management program as the only reasonable way to control growth when our resources become stressed. We suggest that this reevaluation will have to be scheduled every 5 to 7 years to prepare for the 8-year reviews that are in the new Steinberg bill. The League is very concerned about the effects of all the state mandates on local planning. It's clear that the state does not ever know what the local constraints may be. We have worried about the impacts of RHNA numbers on small cities for a long time, but we now hear that Los Angeles is equally concerned about the state mandates. Two things remain of major importance. The plan and the city have constantly talked about and supported the building of affordable housing and providing more open space. However, neither of these have been implemented in any substantive way, and we continue to lose both at a very brisk pace. We will have to design some concrete measures to obtain either of these goals, and Plan Santa Barbara is the best place to announce them. We believe we could support dual density as a possible solution, and anything that limits the size, bulk, and scale of buildings can provide at least minimal open space on the properties themselves. We want you to consider those issues further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kathy McCammon.
Hi, I'm Kathy McCammon, and I'm speaking for the as the League Land Use Consultant. First of all, we want to thank the staff for revising the document. We think they've clarified some of the concepts. The League has continued to stress the importance of living within our resources. While we agree with the goal of a more sustainable community, League also has growth management policies. But living within our physical and natural resources is more than just a League policy. It's contained in the city charter. The electorate has already said that changes that would increase our population should be voted on by the people. So we think it's important that there be some policy having a ballot measure required before the new policies are implemented. There are several policies that we are concerned about. The document needs to be clearer in discussing the change in Euclidean development patterns. While reference is made to mixed use, this is also happening with MODA. The public needs to be told that this means changing zoning as we know it, and that it does away with separate zones for commercial and residential. Under MODA, the division between commercial and residential is gone, but it could also change single-family zones to de facto duplex zones. And people need to know that form-based zoning may also do away with separate zones. Many of the policies rest on the idea of increased density along transit corridors, with the impression being that this will solve our problems. We have a lot of questions about this. As to affordable housing, there's no evidence that the private sector can produce truly affordable housing without subsidies. There are numerous examples of this: the Tobes Project in Goleta, the Mental Health Project in the city, St. Vincent's Project. While granny units is an interesting topic, our informal research has indicated there are already a large number of these units, and amnesty won't solve our problem. People don't want to report them, they don't want the affordable rental limits, and they do not want to have to report the income for tax purposes. Many people build these units themselves, and they didn't want to pay for permits or go to the expense of building them to code. Because so many of these units exist, parking is a problem in many single-family areas. So we think the city should look carefully at this problem before we encourage more granny units, and certainly we would urge you not to reduce parking requirements. We don't think people will abandon their cars because there's nearby transit opportunities. We agree people will use their cars more. Will not use their cars as much. They may walk, bike, carpool, whatever, but they still will use their cars for many of their trips. We're concerned that there's not been enough study or data to support what happens with projects in the South Coast and other small affluent areas where people have a real choice. Another problem is the city doesn't have the money to support a vastly improved transit system. The document says the city's infrastructure is maintained by a fragile network of funding mechanisms. And you've already heard that transit needs more help. Measure A is a start, but there's still more money needed. Parking requirements shouldn't be reduced until there's better transit. High-density condo development along transit corridors will not reduce commuting from North County and Ventura. If we are truly committed to regionalism, we need to accept the fact that the city is part of a larger region, and we need to realize what we have is a regional transportation problem.
Can you wrap up, please?
Sure. The whole area of the commuters needs to be clarified, and let's see, we also ask that you clarify the high-risk fire zone. Can I speak briefly for La Mesa Association? Just
Sure,
about
I'll give you a minute.
Okay. The La Mesa Neighborhoods Association, unfortunately, has not had the opportunity to have a meeting on these policies. Because of the economy, one of the co-presidents has had to work, and I'm guiltily the other co-president, but we've had two of our treasurers pass away on us. We have traditionally opposed narrowing Cliff Drive, and we're very concerned that policy C8 on page 58 may be referring to Cliff Drive. It's very confusing. It talks about storage and other things and doesn't say what it really means. We support preserving single-family zones, and we're definitely a little distressed about MODA because we've been told that it's not really appropriate for the Mesa because of congestion at Castillo and Cliff, Carrillo and Cliff, and Las Pasillas and Cliff. So we would hope that we would have an opportunity to have a meeting on the Mesa neighborhood, because we know some people have already talked about the Mesa, but our association has not had the opportunity to weigh in on this. Thank you very
much. Next we have Lisa Plowman, followed by Mickey Flax. Sorry? Did I do it again? Wow, I'm really excited today. This is just to make sure all those people from UCSB are still awake. Okay, who am I calling? Yeah, Ms. Cox. There you are, followed by Lisa Plowman. Oh, good thing John's keeping me honest. And Bandy, thanks. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Cox-Bolton. I'm the Executive Director of the Coastal Housing Coalition, which represents a broad base of employers and employees on the South Coast. We appreciate the opportunity to weigh in today. We're largely supportive of the updated report, including the sustainability framework and the recognition that living within our resources means that we must house a greater percentage of our local workers as opposed to continuing to export our housing needs to neighboring jurisdictions. First, we want to comment on the growth management policies, specifically LG 1 through 3, which are described in the staff report as setting the broad policy position for residential growth management. These policies prioritize the use of available resource capacities for additional affordable housing over all other development. And we just want to ensure that that language is clear, that by affordable there, what we mean is the traditionally low and very low up to workforce housing, which is consistent in the way that affordable is defined throughout the rest of the document. That just was a little unclear there. We're strongly supportive of the housing goals and objectives, which put an emphasis on increasing housing availability for a variety of income types, as well as expanding the range of housing types and increasing density to accommodate workforce and affordable housing. Within the section on housing, we are particularly supportive of incentives for employer-sponsored housing, as well as the policy to encourage granny flats within the MODA area. For the latter, we hope that by encourage, we will look to expedite permits for those not requiring any special modifications. We strongly encourage the city to look at incentives rather than mandates in terms of smaller unit size, so as to not make it economically infeasible to build. And we're also very supportive of the idea of affordability by design and support incentivizing smaller units through granting increased density, reduced parking, and other requirements. On H8, we would encourage you to expand this. This is the UCSB and City College comment. We just would encourage you to expand that to all private and public schools at all levels in the city, as those are also having trouble recruiting and retaining qualified teachers in terms of incentivizing housing. And would also encourage you to look at PS 12 concerning emergency workforce and noting that housing, the lack of available affordable housing is the primary reason they're not living close to us, so essentially to cite housing in that area as well. And finally, we just want to comment on the scope of the EIR. While we're pleased that the EIR would study a variety of alternatives, including options with residential growth at 4,500 and 7,000 units, we're concerned that the project alternative option bases the residential growth on the historical growth patterns. We believe strongly that the lack of our keeping up with the need for affordable and workforce housing in past years is part of the reason that we find ourselves in the situation we are now. And so we would, hope that we would exceed some of the historical growth patterns in the future years to make sure that we can alleviate that problem and do what we need to do for our local economy, environment, and civic life. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much. Lisa Plowman. Welcome. Thank you for being assertive enough to say, hey, what about me? Thanks.
It's nice.
Right, exactly. We're going to do it.
My secret
Lisa's the one. Thank you. Anyway, let me restart your time because we laughed.
Thank you.
There. Okay.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. I'm Lisa Plowman, and I'm part of an organization, SB for All, that you're aware of. I'm not speaking on all of our issues today. Mickey Flax will be summarizing the letter that we've submitted to you, which I realize actually is missing a page, which we will correct. My comments today are going to focus on the changes to Measure E that were suggested. It actually just came out in this revised draft. And I believe it's policy LG7 that talks about eliminating the ability to transfer development rights from one site to another in our commercial areas. I think, in conversations with people that were around when a Measure E was initiated, this was really a critical element of Measure E when it was adopted. And the TEDR ordinance was adopted subsequent to Measure E's approval. There were two really critical things that happened with a TDR ordinance, and that was you had redevelopment opportunities that were created where none existed because of the limited amount of square footage that was permitted for each developed lot. So when you could transfer, redevelopment could happen to a greater degree than you might otherwise see. And that also you could transfer square footage to properties that could more readily accommodate that level of development, meaning less impact on the community. And this all can occur without ever actually increasing your total commercial square footage in the downtown. So we think it's a really important tool. And I think the city was wise when they believed that this tool would really continue to encourage economic vitality and a strong economy within the community. And I think the purpose and intent of the TEDR ordinance says it all, and I'm only going to cite a couple of them, and they're in our letter. One is to ensure a strong economy by providing a voluntary mechanism which would allow transferring of commercial development between properties, to encourage new development but not new floor area, to provide flexibility and opportunities for redirecting growth within our growth cap, and to encourage the construction of housing. So I think it's really important to look at those purpose and intent points that were at the beginning of that ordinance. And I think it's also important to note when square footage is transferred, that's under full discretionary review by the city. So there's not a risk of things being transferred under the radar without people knowing about it. It's got to be approved by the Planning Commission. The other thing that we wanted to recommend is even increasing some flexibility in TEDR. And it's something we've outlined in our letter, but we talk about the possibility of transferring resource credits in very limited circumstances where you have two projects right next to each other and you transfer square footage from the sending site to the receiving site, and that they may be able to get credit for traffic. Something we think you should think about and consider. And you can see more detail in our letter. I guess in the long run, I know that the city is struggling with the balance of commercial and residential development. But what it seems to me like this new growth management policy does is try and address long-range growth in the community, and that maybe the Planning Commission's concerned about square footage that's been banked since the adoption of Measure E. If that's your concern, let's look at it from that perspective. Let's lower the commercial growth cap rather than taking away a tool that allows you to transfer between two properties. And at the very least, what I think you ought to do, instead of being really specific in this document about what you want to do to Measure E or the TEDR, say that you want to study changes to that. And then let's look at it in a more detailed, thorough way so that there aren't unintended consequences like stymieing redevelopment of areas that we think are important in the community.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Mickey Flax, followed by Max Josephson.
Hi, I'm Mickey Flax, co-chair of SB for All, and basking in the glow of the impending changes in our country. I come here not to bury anybody, but to praise the staff and the population of Santa Barbara that turned out for all of these hearings, for what I think is an excellent document, particularly the emphasis on sustainability. We in SB for All talked about sustainability as containing three principal aspects: protection of the environment, economic well-being, and social equity. And I think that this document tries to achieve that, and it's also well stated when it says on page 20, resource capacities can be increased or decreased depending on lifestyle preferences, conservation strategies, technological advances, availability of alternative resources or substitutes, and changes in relative resource costs. Santa Barbara can grow and evolve and also retain a high quality of life and an amenable environment with foresight in the management of its resources. Good example of that is the MOTA concept, which is an important integration of transportation and development and a cornerstone of sustainability. Another important aspect, and again one that reflects the staff's listening to the community, is policy LG1, which prioritizes affordable housing. I think that's key to making ours a more sustainable, more socially equal community. A general plan update is a document guiding future, not past, development. The maintenance of status quo as we look 20 or 30 years into the future is not a very reasonable expectation. The problem is how to guide future development in ways that create sustainable communities, not exactly the same as we now have, but sustainable communities. And I think that's what this document tries to address and does a very good job of it. On the EIR, just one point, the what is called the higher growth alternative should probably be called the jobs housing alternative and should include a limited commercial expansion with the increase in housing units to the approximate zoning capacity, which is about 7,000. This alternative is very important to be studied because I believe it may well prove to be the environmentally superior alternative. And that is something we ought to know. We had said that in Santa Barbara for All that we look to the future, not the past. We imagine a city that is in the forefront of embodying and demonstrating the principles of sustainability, managed growth, and environmental responsibility. And as we move toward an uncertain future, bringing many new challenges, one thing is certain: change is inevitable. Our community will continue to be affected by the changes in our region, in the state, and in the world. Our general plan must include the kind of flexibility needed to adapt to these forces of change. These policy recommendations are a good start in that direction. Thank you.
Max Josephson. Mr. Josephson, I see you note that you're in opposition to something on Shoreline Drive, and that's not on our agenda today. So what we're expecting is to speak to Plan Santa Barbara. Is that something that you're prepared to do?
Okay, I can talk about that.
Okay, fine. You have 2 minutes.
Well, I would like to recommend the 1 million square feet because it's the lowest number, and that will be more sustainable than making bigger numbers of open square feet. I also think that we need to not change the roads to 2-lane roads because that will just encourage more people to drive cars. I think we need to instead let the traffic build up so that people find ulterior modes of transportation. We need more incentives for people to ride the buses, and I think that not building more roads would be a good incentive.
Thank you very much. And when, I'll give this to staff, and when this item that you're interested in comes up, we'll let you know.
Okay, thank you.
Next, Alex Peugeot, followed by our final speaker, Farmars Nabiari. Thanks. Alex?
Good afternoon. I'm Alex Peugeot. I'm speaking on behalf of the Coalition for Sustainable Transportation. We have sustainability as our middle name, and we agree with the comments that sustainability does not mean to maintain the status quo. That is not sustainability. We support specifically the circulation items on your packet because they reinforce the circulation element update of 1998, in which the overall goal was that the use of private automobiles for personal transportation should be a choice and not a necessity. And these goals do that. Specifically, C1 to reduce energy, of course. C2 to make pedestrian crossings of more visible, of a higher quality, safer. C3 to prioritize bike lanes over curbside parking. C4 the increased car share and bike share as possibilities. C6 regional commuting transit, of course. C8 excess motor vehicle capacity, and I think the previous speaker misunderstood what it meant. I think the idea is based on, let's say, what happened on Bath and Castile on the early, late 80s, or Shoreline, the Shoreline Promenade that was inaugurated a few years ago, or Upper de la Vina, went from 5 or 4 lanes to 3. This all meant a reduction. And of course, my own street on Chapada, we went from 2 lanes to 1 lane. And they all had opposition, of course, and they were greatly received afterwards, and nobody will go backwards now. Others could be C9, car-free zones, a very controversial thing right now, but it could be implemented with baby steps, with temporary closures, like farmers markets and so forth. C12, the transit funding for TODs, very, very important. C14, to downtown parking, to update the CBD boundary for a parking district. C15, to include parking district for Upper State Street and the Funk Zone. C16, parking maximums. That's something that most jurisdictions have now. C18, parking within MODA. And C23, trip generation rates, very important that you include all modes of transportation as trip generation, not just vehicles. We also support the LL9, the whole MODA concept, and LG15, the sustainable neighborhood plans. Very important concept. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peugeot. And our final speaker, Farmars Nabavi. I hope I said it okay. I think we'll find out.
My name is Faramars Nabavi, and for the past year I'd lived in the Moda at 1012 Laguna Street, and I'm currently searching for a new apartment. That's relevant to my testimony today. I support the Moda concept, and I would like to see more multimodal transit use, and I'd like to see measures taken that would support that, such as expanding the amount of bike racks on buses, and make sure that that is prioritized. I know that with the strong support that was established for Measure A in the past election, I think that the city should make it a policy to encourage the MTD and the state legislature to allow the South Coast to establish a gas tax surcharge to expand transit and to provide a dedicated revenue stream that's correlated with the variable costs of our transit use. I support dedicated bike facilities, particularly bike paths and prioritizing bike lanes over on-street parking as described in the general plan for the Moda area. I also support the goal of reducing single occupancy vehicle use to 50% and having more car-free zones. Given the large discrepancy between the workforce population and residents, is a prime cause for the drop in the quality of life due to traffic and pollution. I'd like to see greater than 7,000 units of new housing, provided that all new net units are priced substantially below market rate. As someone who's finding it difficult to find a new apartment I can afford, I'm directly affected by this lack of affordable housing. Finally, I would like to support the section on community gardens. And I'd like to specifically make sure that the city establishes in the code support for edible landscaping both on private property and to encourage edible landscaping where feasible on public property as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read a few things into the record that we received on our DS here, and some of the speakers have already spoken, so although we have your letter and we've read it, I won't have to read that into the record. However, we have received mail from Paula Westbury, who the synopsis is the plan update is erroneous, and she does wish us to be well. Kellum DeForest, he is concerned about no reference made to the Mills Act and its benefits to preservation of landmark structures, importance of preservation of cultural landscapes and significant trees being omitted, and why are the objectives in the past tense in CH1. From Fred Sweeney from the Upper East, there's quite a paragraph at the end that we should note about second units. Then we have SB for all. We all have that. Cars are basic, and we have from Christy Suresh. I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but from the Coalition of Community Wellness, and they are pleased that we are putting in part of our general plan update coordinating with wellness. And also, she is urging air quality and respiratory health being checked. And let's see, we got the league in there already, and we got Gil, Barry. I guess we're okay then. So with that, I will close public comment, and we'll bring it back to the attention of the commission. All right. Who would like to be? Oh, I see we have beginnings. Addison, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for staff. It was raised both in written correspondence and in public testimony today that there exists a city policy that will require a public vote for any policies to potentially influence growth. Well, obviously, a general plan potentially influences growth. Would you comment on that? If that truly is in place, then it sounds like our whole schedule goes out the window because this will have to be placed on a ballot.
Mm-hmm.
Chair Larson and Commissioner Thompson, I need to follow up on that quote or statement made during the hearing. That is not my knowledge. The person was speaking to Charter Section 1507, which requires the supermajority vote of the City Council of 5 affirmative votes for general plan amendments and zone changes. In the same comment, they followed and said city policy requiring a vote of the people, and I have no knowledge of that, such a requirement. So I intended on following up on that today, and I don't know if the city attorney has anything to add, but I have never read or been referred to find such a section before.
Mr. Chair, or Madam Chair, and members of the Commission, also I heard the public comment mention that it was an advisory measure, and advisory measures from the electorate can be adopted as recommendations to the City Council, giving them instruction on issues, but unlike a charter amendment, it doesn't require any particular action. So again, as Ms. Weiss said, I'm going to say I wasn't working for the city in 1975. I was in the city.
Were you born?
I was in kindergarten in Monte Vista.
Now we're getting to the heart of the matter. Thank you, Mr. Vincent. Let's see. I believe next was Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I presume some of my colleagues have some questions, and I'm happy to defer my comments to make sure those questions come first. But I just wanted to make the observation that we've passed a threshold today with our last speaker, who is the first person to refer to his location as being in the Moda neighborhood. And I think that says something about what we've been working on for the past 2.5, 3 years.
Thank you very much. And Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to ask a couple of questions about something that Mr. Ledbetter and I were discussing a couple of days ago, and it's not in the material that's before us. We were discussing, first of all, TEDR, and then secondly, small additions. And as I understand the small addition, there are, at this point under Measure E, there are 10 of them, 10 or 30,000 square feet of small additions allowed per year. Am I correct on that?
That is correct. With the Measure E program, 30,000 per year were allocated for a total of 600,000 square feet.
For a total of 600,000 square feet over a 20-year period.
Correct.
And then what happens to that is that those that are not used of the 30,000 square feet each year, then the remainder is transferred to the economic development category.
Correct.
Is that right? Now, we didn't get the pie that we're so used to over the years of seeing in this material, and that small addition component, I didn't see it mentioned here. We have the minor addition square footage, which is 1,000 square feet. Is that right? 1,000, less than 1,000, 999. So the proposed 1,000,005 square feet, does that include 600,000 of small addition, or where does small addition fit into the proposed allotment of Measure E or number 2 square footage?
If I may, we have been discussing a policy that generally, it states the intent to extend Measure E with the remaining Measure E square footage. And I think staff has tried a number of times. I'm not sure we're all on the same page with all the numbers lining up yet, because we believe that the remaining square footage, let's just call it 1.5, is in need of being reallocated. that the old assumptions of how much square footage would be available each year under small addition we just talked about was 30,000 per year. That would not be available. That would not work in the new extension of 1.5. As I mentioned, 30,000 times 20 years is 600,000. The reason that won't work, I believe, is we start, like we did in the prior Measure E, with a certain level of acknowledgement that there are approved and pending projects. And we have talked about this, that the approved and pending projects don't all go forward. And what has happened also before with any approved or pending project that doesn't go forward, that is folded into a catch-all of economic development. Now, we need to redefine what happens with this time's pending and approved. But if you take that number, which is approximately 600 to 700,000 square feet, and if you made the old assumption of 600,000 square feet for small additions, you don't have anything left for vacant land, you don't have anything left for community priorities. So we've always been thinking that we would be working through a detailed reallocation program with the Commission as a necessary implementing tool. And that is why staff, again, I think in this last report, we're trying to be more clear to everyone that we have been thinking that the amount of reallocated square footage are in those traditional categories. The 1.5 as they exist today, which is only 60,000 in the small addition, because there's only 2 years left. So there's only 60,000 left there. But there's the existing pot of economic development, there's the remaining community priority, there's the pending and approved, and there's a certain amount of vacant land. And so given the policy directions in the other land use and growth management to encourage community benefit land uses and such, we really were anticipating a much larger pot of community benefit land use, perhaps fold economic development and community priority together as one pool and things like that. We really haven't talked about all of those details. We've been fairly comfortable with the concept as we understood it, that this was looking to extend the 1.5 and that there could be a rebalancing. And then every time we talk about this, we try to mention that staff is making other assumptions about the non-residential growth. And that is that demolition and reconstruction, at least on site, is a non-Measure E allocation. It's not an allocation. It's outside of Measure E. And then the approach that was taken to allow up to 1,000 square feet as, again, a below-the-line non-Measure E, I think has served us in the community very well in that property owners have been able to make minor improvements without a whole lot of process and review. So that has been our explanation, and I think you have the basics down based on, hopefully, my reiteration in the prior reviews.
Well, and if I can play it back to you to see that I got it right, then the 1.5 million square feet that is at least one suggested number that's in our document today would be then reviewed at a later date to massage it into a form or whatever number, obviously, that the city comes up with during the deliberation process. But then that number would then go through a massage process of allocating, and whether it's community priority or small addition or whatever we want to call it. But we would then just have that overall number to work with and allocate out in the future.
Yes, and Ms. Shelton just handed me a document that we presented at the prior Planning Commission meeting, and it does just that. Puts up front the pending and approved, and we will have a policy. What do you want to do when those expire or don't move forward? Because that does happen. And then just as you said, all of those other categories, we were looking at approximately 900,000. So 600,000 out there in the pending and approved, and 900,000 in a various adding of the existing gets you at 1.5.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
It's Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a related question for staff. And I'm referring to the bottom of page 32, which is a discussion of LG2.
Which are you looking at?
It's the concluding paragraph of LG2, which reads as follows. Non-residential development associated with demolition and replacement of existing square footage on site and sphere annexations are considered separately in addition to the basic 1.5 million square foot limit of new non-residential development. The question I have is the development that is referenced there beyond the 1.5, is that still subject to the living within our resources overarching approach within the policy report that we're looking at? And what I'm asking to understand is, are we loopholing any class of projects, whether they're residential or non-residential, to get through, to avoid the finding of living within our resources or having sufficient resource capacity?
I think I'll keep the answer on the non-residential. You mixed in residential, but we'll just stay on non-residential for the moment. The reconstruction of non-residential square footage under the current program at the city is in most instances a discretionary review. You cannot attain a building permit for a new building without going to the Architectural Board of Review, and you can't make any alteration within El Pueblo Viejo without going to Historic Landmarks Commission. But the reconstruction of non-residential square footage in our current program here is it does not require a Measure E development plan. So it is subject to a discretionary review and a CEQA review, and oftentimes you see that that project, that development is part of a condominium plan or a coastal permit. But reconstruction in and of itself does not require the Measure E charter findings. And so if someone proposes to reconstruct square footage that would have impacts on traffic or a safety impact or a view impact or whatever, we would be doing an environmental assessment, and if the impacts found in that assessment were significant and unavoidable, then a statement of overriding considerations would have to be made. So I'm not sure if what you're saying is that it is outside of the loop. It is outside of the loop in terms of it is not subject to the limitation of no overriding that is the current standard of Measure E. But it is in the loop in terms of being a discretionary action for which, you know, you complete environmental review and you can't override resource impact. I mean, you can override resource impacts if you can override them. So it's a discretionary decision. And that is the standard for reconstruction and minor additions. We are trying to more clearly acknowledge what has been our reality with regard to annexations. I mean, annexation and what we're trying to do in this CIR and this discussion point here is that development does occur within the sphere of influence or on properties that later become, you know, annexed to the city, and that that development comes in as existing development and not subject to Measure E. But once they are in the city, then they're only entitled to the same minor addition and the same city programs. But we wanted to be explicit that, and that is why our EIR is going to analyze what are the impacts of potential reasonably foreseeable development in this sphere of influence around the city. So that's what I understand that paragraph to mean.
Okay, I think I'm with you on the reconstruction piece, because that's not really a net addition of new square footage. It was here in the foreseeable past, and it's here now, and you're going to tear it down and replace it in like kind. I guess my nervousness is that in the annexation situation, we might be encouraging somebody to go out, build in the county, and under a different set of standards, and then once they've got that development completed, they come in with an annexation proposal. And I guess that's just the luck of the draw. We have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis and make the LAFCO findings that we have to make. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and I just wanted to let you know our track record, at least, has been that if a development is adjacent to the city and is going to be served by city services, and we have been pretty effective in working with the county and LAFCO to say, looks like this project needs to go through city review. So you'll be seeing a project at Foothill Triangle in the next period of time, and that has consistently been the city's position, and that applicant is coming in compliance with Measure E. But I understand, I have that same concern that it could certainly happen. Build up the hotel just outside the city and then, or whatever.
Right.
That's possible, yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. White, were you reaching for your button? Okay. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess we're finished with asking questions, and I would just like to summarize my position on what's before us today. First, I'd like to thank the staff for doing all of the excellent job of putting together all the various disparate comments they've received from various and sundry individuals, groups, and the Planning Commission to come up with the document that we have before us today. And I really thank all of the groups and individuals in the city that have put forth all the effort that they have in making some really valuable inputs to this. I read through this several times, and going back a few weeks because I've been working on the subcommittee with staff. And at first I started to enumerate in my own list of things that I would maybe suggest to improve it, changes and all that. And then I got to thinking, we can spend forever trying to make something perfect, and we will never make something that everybody in the city agrees with, because some of the positions we've heard are mutually exclusive and polar opposites in some cases. And we can keep on adding and changing and trying to make a better product, but I think what we have here is worthy of moving the process forward to the City Council so that we can get on with the environmental review and that we can get on with starting to craft the actual general plan language. Everybody needs to understand that this is just one step in the way. This is not the end product. So I'm ready to recommend this policy preferences document to the council after everybody's had their say, and let's move on to the environmental review, the scoping hearing, where we can really hammer out some of these numbers about non-residential and residential numbers to be evaluated for environmental review. And I really hope we can keep moving forward, because in California, we're normally supposed to update our general plan every 10 to 15 years, not take 10 to 15 years to update our general plan. So I think we've come a long way since last December, when we really started pushing on this, and I'd like to keep the process moving forward. So I am ready to recommend moving it forward to the City Council at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. Any other comments? Mr. Justice, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to echo Mr. Thompson's appreciation of the public, particularly those who have haven't previously participated in the planning process and weighed in for the first time. I think those new voices really helped us come up with a better document. I'd also like to explicitly thank Mr. Thompson for his service on the subcommittee. And I think his view and perspective on things has really contributed to an outstanding document here. And from my standpoint, I think negotiating a policy document like this is both an art and a science. And there's a lot of back and forth that has happened between the commission, the subcommittee, and staff. And we've really rolled up our sleeves and gotten into it, hammer and tong at times. But I think what we have in front of us today is a very much improved draft that shows a remarkable evolution from where we were in December of 2007. It is well structured. It provides a context for planning in the next 20 years. It links past policy and recent studies like the Conditions, Trends, and Issues report and the Development Trends report into this document. It articulates a vision for the future for the next 20 and 30 years. And the land use policies, coupled with the housing strategies, I think provide assumptions to both the slow growth advocates that have addressed the Commission, as well as those who are promoting the development of affordable housing. And there may be some nervousness that remains, but I think for the most part we've got the type of assurances built into this document that address the concerns and worries of both of those major caucuses of interest. I think it provides specific guidance on the MODA, the mobility-oriented design or development area, which I think is a groundbreaking section in this document and integrates not just transportation but housing and community character and connectivity, and I think that is really one of the highlights of this whole policy exercise. And last but not least, the adaptive management framework, I think, sets a new precedent for being proactive in anticipating and responding to changing conditions and outcomes, and really makes this document a much more organic set of policies than we've had at any point in the past in the city. And specifically, it sets a new precedent in terms of integrating the housing element into that framework that really says living within our resources and sustainability principles are core assumptions upon which all our land uses are based. I think there are some outstanding issues, but like Mr. Thompson, I think that we've got a high-quality document here, and I think that I would benefit from a discussion with my colleagues on a couple of issues, whether we resolve them today or put them into a transmittal memo that characterizes either particularly priorities of the Commission or differences of opinion, of interpretation of the Commission. I think that carrying that forward can enhance the chance of us coming up with a consensus recommendation today and still honor any differences of opinion that may reside on the Commission level at this point and carry those forward to the City Council. I think the first issue has to do with this non-residential square footage. In my opinion, it's still too high. I talked at the last meeting about a 1.5 million square foot total, and we're more transparent now, and we're up at 2.0, 2.2 million. And while that 1.5 figure is a position, my underlying interest is to make sure that our non-residential component of growth is coherent and consistent with the goal of having meaningful jobs housing balance written into the land use and housing element and the growth management piece. So I would like to see some movement towards the 1.5 million total. That's a point of discussion. Secondly is the sequencing of the land use element and the housing element. At the last meeting, and in our meeting notes, we heard from staff that it's going to be extremely difficult to get an extension from HCD to defer the completion of the housing element. I don't think that relieves us of pushing forward with all due speed on getting a land use element crafted and in front of the City Council so that we don't get out of sequence, because the land use policies must inform the housing policies. Otherwise, we're having some potential inconsistencies. Third, and next to last, I think the objectives are included in the draft. I think they're a good start. They reflect some good intentions, but they, in my mind, need to be fine-tuned, possibly revised and reframed. I don't know that that's our role today or tomorrow, but I would hope to get some assurance from staff that we will have a voice in improving those so that they are truly responsive to the goals we've set out and that they are measurable and they're explicit. And I think those are the areas in which we need some improvement. On the EIR focus, I think our first item as far as the non-residential square footage obviously plays into the alternatives that we ask staff to look at or recommend that staff look at. My hope is that and I don't necessarily agree with this 3 million square foot number because I think it's so out of whack as far as the jobs housing piece, but I think what we need to do is to craft our alternatives as kind of building blocks that we can use to allow us to construct a hybrid that may end up to be the environmentally superior alternative if our preferred policy is not that. So that instead of just having X amount of residential and X and Y amount of non-residential, if we can craft that in a way that we can create alternative Z that's maybe a blend of some of that, I think that would go a long way in improving the utility of the document. But I'm sitting here prepared to take notes and hope that if we do take some straw polls, I can try to capture the difference of approach and maybe contribute to a recommendation or some kind of cover letter that either comes through the subcommittee or whatever to give this some momentum, to get it to City Council, move it forward, and let the chips fall where they may.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. I was thinking of the subcommittee, too, and I want to thank the subcommittee for all the work they've done and join in other thanks, and I want to give Ms. Jacobs a chance to talk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like my fellow commissioners, I appreciate the immense amount of work that has gone into this over the past year on the part of the staff and the commissioners and the public. I especially appreciate in this draft that the conditions, trends, and issues report is integrated into the text so that we're not relying on the reader to refer back and forth to different texts. It's right there, and that consolidates the documents in a way that starts to work much better. I also appreciate the historic resources being up front in the sustainability framework, since that wasn't there before and now it is. And I do agree with some public comment that still the historic resources section seems a bit light. And the reason it seems light is because the weight of existing policies is so great. But some reference to that in this document, I think, would be an important response to public comment and public interest in that preservation aspect of the plan. And then, again, commenting that the triumvirate of new policies in here, the MODA, the Sustainable Neighborhood Plans, and the forthcoming Adaptive Management Program creates a really new and dynamic kind of general plan. And I'm very proud of the work that's gone into that on everyone's part. one part of it in the MODA that I want to reiterate one more time as this goes forward is the fact that money and funding is going to be necessary to create the balance that makes the MODA the kind of neighborhood or area that we want it to be. And I'm glad to see on page 30 that the focus of city capital improvement program expenditures would be focusing on the mobility options in this area. I'm glad to see it stated so concretely, but I will be looking throughout this process to see, okay, where's the money going to come from if all we do in our policies is create more housing, telling people that it'll be great because there'll be all these alternative transportation and open space options, then we're setting ourselves up for a great disappointment. So I want to make sure that the money is there for transportation and also for open space. And I agree with my colleague, Mr. Thompson, that I think this document is ready for City Council. I think it's ready to go forward with, I would support it going forward from the Commission to Council at this point so that they can have a public hearing and start to take in some information on it as well. Regarding Mr. Jostis' items, if we can, I would support fitting in a lower commercial option into alternative policies. Number one, that's our low growth option. We have a lower housing number and, if possible, a $1 million measure, 1 million square foot measure E, plus the 500,000 square foot non-measure E to create a 1.5 million. I would support that. And sequencing of the land use and housing elements, I agree with Mr. Jostis. We don't want to lose track of one and become so focused on the housing element and that deadline that we lose the momentum that we have gained for our land use element. And then lastly, on objectives and the revision of objectives, as I said today, I think this document is ready to go forward. And I have said before and still think that the bones of the adaptive management program are in here and are in the objectives. No one has sat down with a spreadsheet yet to say, here's the objectives, here's what an indicator would be to create the adaptive management program that's going to go with that. I don't think that we can do that in the time that we have before this document goes to Council. But I absolutely support that step and would look for staff's guidance on how that can happen. I think in our timeline it happens next year. So, again, just very pleased to be able to support a future motion to move this forward to Council.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Bartlett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, first of all, I really wanted to thank Commissioner Jostis for adding in the vision of sustainable Santa Barbara. I think it's an incredible preamble to this document, but it does point out the fact that we are so looking to the future and what we hope to have come out of all this, and yet all of the EIR assumptions are based on the past. So there seems to be a tiny bit of disconnect, one looking out the windshield, one looking in the rearview mirror. So I wish that the EIR alternatives, and I know we're all going to discuss the numbers and the ranges, could be analyzed in such a way that they can be cross-tabbed differently. If we want to link the smallest commercial with the highest residential, if it's analyzed in a way that we can craft the hybrid that Commissioner Jostis brought up, I think it would be better to put it forward without a preferred project alternative. I want to see the results from the EIR so that we know what we're basing it on and then create our preferred alternative. To come up with a preferred alternative before we analyze it seems reverse to me. So I think a lot of people in the past have mentioned, how can we pick a preferred when we don't analyze first? So if we can analyze it in a way that we can assemble the parts in perhaps a different formula than what we see before us, then I think that would serve us the best. So hopefully we can have an EIR analysis that will allow us to do that. In order to have flexibility, I think, in the future for both the non-residential and residential components, which we're talking about in this delicate balance, what the two have in common are water, traffic, and sewer, all the resource components. And I would like to see that both of those be boiled down to their basic component parts so that we have the flexibility in the future. If we find we need more housing and less commercial, there's a way to convert one category to the other, since they all share the same common resources, and the resources are what are limiting our thoughts and ideas as we move forward. So if we have a pool of resources, create common metrics between the two categories so that we have flexibility in the future to transition back and forth as times change. I mean, as we all know, the last 2 months have practically changed the world, so we need to have some way of having flexibility built into this document. One of the things that I noticed in looking at the latest staff report was the topic of the TEDR, which we added, I think, as a result of our last discussion. And what struck me funny about it was eliminating, or the proposal to eliminate TEDR for non-residential, and at the same time adding TEDR for residential. If it works so well for the non-residential and we want to use it in residential, why would we get rid of it in commercial? I think it really gives us a great flexibility tool to put the existing footages in the appropriate locations without adding more growth. So I really think that that tool needs to stay in place. And I think there needs to be further discussion as to whether or not there are instances where the credits should go with that in terms of traffic and water and the other implications that are associated with moving those rights. And what strikes me about that is if we actually consider something as the Naples TEDR so that we can save the coast, is there a component piece of water usage if Naples is getting its water from Kachuma just as we are, that resource also can transfer so that it doesn't become an impact to the city so that we can save our coast. So I think if we can boil these different uses down to their resource components, then we have the flexibility to be adjusting to the future as it unfolds. I think the adaptive management component is really going to serve us well. I just hope that, given the fact that the increment of growth will be so small over the next 10 years when we implement that we measure the new component pieces and compare them to the existing similar parts that are existing so that we have a true measure rather than did the less than 1%, less than 0.1% of growth change the overall bottom line. I mean, it's going to be imperceptible. You've got to compare the new versus what we had previously that hasn't changed. And I think, obviously water usage is a huge issue, and most of the discussion points seem to be relative to new development, but we've already set ourselves up with exceeding the current standards for Title 24 by a large amount. The new projects, I don't think, are the ones that will be wasting water. I hope that we can implement not just a suggested policy for the remaining 99.9% of water usage, but really come up with a way that we can go after the real wastage that we currently have. In terms of the amount of non-residential footage, I tend to agree with Commissioner Jostes. I have always wanted one of the assumptions for the EIR study to be a lower number for the non-residential and a higher number on the residential so that we can really achieve or come closer to achieving the jobs housing balance. So I just hope that the analysis is done, given the ranges that we have, that we can perhaps craft that alternative once we see the results of the EIR. And I think those are the big bullet points. I think it's ready to go forward, and we can noodle on it when it comes back after the EIR when we have real data to chew on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Bartlett. And now Commissioner White.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll follow on. I just we can't repeat this often enough. I feel such a great appreciation and respect for the team that has worked on this project now for it's 3-4 years. Is it 5? Anyway, it's 3, 4. 2.5, 3. Well, it feels like it's obviously been a very long haul, and there have been a lot of rewrites that were unexpected, and staff dug in and made it happen, and the subcommittee held staff's feet to the fire. And thank you, subcommittee, and thank you, staff, for that difficult and noble interface. I agree. This document's ready to move forward. I have a couple of there's one policy question. What I would like to do is at least have perhaps a couple of straw votes, or I know we have this letter concept, which I think is excellent. But there are a couple of issues that I have a little trouble with. And I also have a lot of faith in this process because, as I've mentioned before, I've had the pleasure of working on updates of the general plan of, is that 20 years ago now? Over the 13 years that I've been doing this, we've done updates of half a dozen components, if not more, of the general plan. So the process it's taken the full 20 years to get the airport, to get the waterfront, to get and then even to invent some new elements, even the circulation. Mr. Dayton's really visionary work with pedestrian and alternate circulation that's just 20 years ago was thought of as a sort of a little sidebar, and which now, of course, is really core to the city's quality of life. So I have confidence that elements of this plan will still be worked on 15 years from now and refined, and will be the constant polishing and burnishing of the city. Also, the adaptive management piece, which Mr. Jostis really has led the way on, I think will that's just going to be common currency now probably for planning in the region, and probably it'll be spreading throughout the state. The two pieces that I'm concerned about is one, there's a sort of a hard statement that the 60-foot maximum height in the city building height shall remain. And I would appreciate, Madam Chair, what I would like to do is, since I object to that, I do not see this city going to a 5th story. I haven't heard word one anybody has the courage to say, let's go to a 5th floor. There's one in the audience. He hasn't quite gotten to either Planning Commission or City Council status yet, but although that day may come. But anyway, without a 5th story, I don't see the need for 60 feet. And so that's one element that kind of sticks in my craw. And we also obviously have a lively diversity of opinions about the TEDR. And I'm certainly game to have this discussed. First of all, the development community has not been involved in this conversation yet, and needs to be, except for Ms. Plowman, and that's it. And of course, this is too big of an item to just. I don't want it to be something that gets near being policy without full vetting by the stakeholders involved in that. That we learned long ago that anything that happens behind somebody's back is anathema. So that's just we know that that's how that process needs to be worked out. So, but really the 60-foot height, Madam Chair, is the one thing that sticks out for me as I say, all I need is a straw vote where I can object to it, and then I'm willing to support the document. I understand. And then finally, what I've noticed with the objectives, and that I appreciate that those were brought in late in the game, is that some of them are really tight. I mean, we've got a few of them that just say something's got to happen. By the 50-50 is one. It says by a certain date we're going to have 50-50. And on others it just says we're going to get a little better. And if we're going to have an objective, I'd like it to have that kind of waypoint where we say, then by the year 2010 we're going to have X number of new affordable units in. So just start to make the objectives have some gears to it. At least that's how I've worked with objectives in my planning experience. So again, I'm game to have that be a work in progress, but that's something that we've introduced the concept, and I think it's a very good one. It needs some extra work. So again, thank you all. And I didn't mention, my goodness, what an educated and passionate public we've had when you think about the groups that have brought treatises forward of excellent planning. I look around, and there are a few of the hardest core still here, and we're here first. And thank each and every one of you for your focus, your insight, and your hard work.
Thank you very much, Commissioner White. And Commissioner Thompson, do you have additional comment?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, Commissioner Joseph kind of blindsided me there before, and I can't allow that to happen. So I think everybody needs to know that while the staff did all the heavy lifting on this stuff, Commissioner Jostes has his fingerprints all over this document, and he has been the leadership effort on our subcommittee to bring this to pass. So anything he says about me goes back in order of magnitude to him. So thank you for your work, John.
I really think that we are so fortunate to have this group on this project, really. I just can't thank the talented, educated, intelligent people on this commission enough. And I don't usually get the opportunity to express it, but I am so awed to be seated with them even, because these are people who care deeply and who work tirelessly, and it's amazing to me. So on that, I'm going to ask them, especially Commissioner White, how would you like that straw vote worded?
I would like a straw vote on whether the city of Santa Barbara should retain a 60-foot height limit in the downtown area.
All right. So then we'll say all those in favor of retaining the 60-foot height limit in downtown, please raise your hand.
Chair Larson?
Clarification?
Yeah, maybe
sorry.
I'd like to, let's play with the motion just a little bit.
Play away.
My thought is let's put it in the context of the Plan Santa Barbara policy language. Because I don't know that you want to, we don't, I don't know that you really want to vote today. You know, that might be November 09, but today, let's look at the idea behind the development of a policy regarding building height is clearly because of the amount of interest of the subject in the community. And the approach to the building height issue that we understood our original direction was work with the community, work with the commission, come up with a draft policy, and also ensure that you will study a reduction consistent with the charter amendment. So the EIR will study the charter amendment language. That's what our direction's been. So the question before the commission, I think, is to look at the policy CH10, which is on page 55, and perhaps Commissioner White's motion would be preference or request that CH10 be revised to state a preference for a lower height, allowance of 4 stories, and compatibility and sensitivity to surrounding structures. You know, what are the key things from a policy standpoint that you're looking for to reduce the building height from 60 to a lower number while retaining the 4-story limitation, standard as a maximum, while addressing historic resources and neighboring residential zones or something? I could try to help you a little bit more, but my main point is that I think the straw vote should be on, do you support the language as is, or would you like to see the policy direction in CH10 be towards a reduction of 60 feet? We will study the 60-foot standard in the EIR under the no project. So we already have the no project, which is 60. We already have the Save El Pueblo Viejo in the alternative 1. This was meant to be what the majority of the commission and ultimately the majority of the council wants to study under the project. So I think your motion would be you would like if you want this commission to recommend other than that, then you could put that in the in a direction you would like it to go, or another commissioner could say, a separate straw vote, I move that this does represent for us the alternative would be studied, and then you can vote against it.
Right.
Either way.
Thank you. That's. I think that my suggestion to the chair did that, and it may be that there's a majority vote that would support the 60 feet, in which case we move forward. And as I say, I'm anxious to vote for this package, and I appreciate that the Save El Pueblo Viejo option is on the table already. And if I had, one ideal would be that it be the project option. But I wanted to at least get on record as that the 60-foot was bigger than I was comfortable with, partially because I don't see a 5-story option, and I don't want a 5-story option on the table either for this city. So I want to continue, Madam Chair, to see where this goes. Anyway, with the, I suppose what we could do is say the building height limits in downtown residential buffer areas. We could eliminate the 60-foot and simply refer to the sensitivity to the two howevers as one way to have consensus on that. But as I say, I'm game to just have it be the 60-foot straw vote.
And look at all these lights that are on. We've overstimulated everyone. Mr. Bartlett. And if you are expecting me to phrase the straw vote.
No, I had some other wording issues that I wanted to plug in before we craft the rest of it. In the first bullet point at the end, I think it should be adjacent to residential zoned neighborhoods. And in the beginning of the second bullet point, it should be where adjacent to designated historic structures. And then I think we want to repeat that word in the bold title at the top, next to designated historic structures. So I want to clean up that wording. And then perhaps the reference to the building height should just go away. It's just, maybe it should be the building height downtown shall, and then the first bullet point would be transition away from blah, 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 and we don't even make reference to height. And I think right now it's just like the EIR analysis. We don't know what we prefer until we get results back. Let's not pick our preferences first. So I would be amenable to that.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. And I'm just going to go right down the row. Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't support the inclusion of the 60-foot number in the document because I think it sets up a false dynamic that is already trumped by all of the other community design policies. It's my strong feeling that the other however many community design policies coupled with our land use element policies coupled with our parking and all of those as a package will result in lower height buildings in general, but allows for an exceptional structure that may get up to 60 feet if it has a compelling reason to do so. But I think by putting in the 60-foot number like Mr. Bartlett, it sets up a dynamic that doesn't contribute to the finesse that takes place in the city planning process.
Chair Larson.
I guess that's in agreement with Mr. Bartlett and maybe in agreement with Mr. White.
Well, that helps me frame the straw vote, too.
Chair Larson?
Yes.
I think we should spend a little bit of time on this, but I just want to suggest that next Tuesday evening at 6 p.m., the City Council is very likely to initiate a charter amendment. And I think it will make sense for us to consider asking the Council on December 11th, would you like the project to reflect the charter amendment that you're likely to initiate? It seems like that wouldn't make sense to be the city project if the Council is saying let's study a reduction to 45 feet and an allowance up to 60. So I think we should spend a little bit of time on this, but on the other hand, it's probably going to mirror what the Council action is next week. And again, in the vein of not trying to make it too perfect, but make your intention clear, I think staff would be fine to reduce or to eliminate the number at this point and just have it in general. But I really have a concern about inserting the word designated historic structure, the word designated, because there are many historic resources and structures in our community that have yet to be designated. And we need to, in a CEQA process and city policy, treat them as if they're designated, and they probably, hopefully, will be someday. So I think we were intentional in that language of saying historic rather than designated. But I think the direction that you're going in, if you could just shape it up, I think it'll be fine, and then we'll see next week, in the coming weeks, what the Council would like to put in there, maybe the proposed charter amendment language.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm fine with just removing the 60-foot as I think I was sort of talking around it, and Mr. Bartlett nailed it, and that would work fine for me, although I appreciate Ms. Weiss's comment about the designated needs not to be in there. Secondly, just a respectful amendment to what Mr. Bartlett was saying. I do think we need to have, at least it's like projects that we work on the rest of the week, where you'd still have to end up, you start with one that's the preferred project, and even though you know that as the EIR goes along that you're going to get jiggled and jostled one way or another, but that you still have to start with a navigation, an endpoint that gives you something to shoot at. So I'm okay with, and just as with this, there are dozens of tinkers in here, and it may be something that, Madam Chair, we get the chance to just each perhaps give our little memo of tinkers in some way to even just a word like that we do the minutes, which may help in the adjustment of the document. But certainly we need a specific project to start with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. I see that Mr. Thompson's light is on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I think talking about a straw vote that is, do we agree or disagree with 60-foot height limit is overly simplistic, and I wouldn't like to vote either way on that because it's a much more complex issue as been discussed here. I think if we do anything, removing the reference to a height limit and keep the policies in a more general terms, pending the outcome of what appears to be shaping up as two competing ballot initiatives in November of next year, would be a preferable way to go for me. I don't want to try to prejudge how that's going to shake out in a vote here on a pure height limit when it's a more complex issue than that.
Thank you. Are you comfortable with that, Mr. White?
Again, if the language, I'm sure that as the motion is made that change is in the works, and so I will be fine with that. Thank you.
Right. So I would like to have some direction from the commission as to, first of all, Commission, here's my question for you. Do you feel we need a straw vote or any straw votes at this time? That's number one. Number two is I'm hoping that our objective could be getting the subcommittee to draft a letter with these discussion items addressed a little bit in the letter from us to City Council to accompany the document, similar to as we did for the State Street study. And I think that's what I'm thinking about. Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The one item that was on Mr. Jostes' list that would be appropriate to address at this time is the commercial square footage and whether we want to have one of the alternatives reflect a lower commercial square footage. And I think I said earlier I would be in support of that, but we haven't really had a straw vote on that item. A straw vote would go something like, should alternative policies number 1, which is the low growth alternative, reflect a Measure E allotment of 1 million square feet, a non-Measure E of 0.5 million square feet for a total of 1.5 million square feet, if that is in the direction that Mr. Jostes was hoping to go. And then as a follow-up to that, I think the rest would go into a letter that could be a cover to go to council with our recommendation of this document. So do we want to have a straw vote on the...
I certainly would be happy to do that. Does that sound...
Madam Chair?
Yes.
My preference would be to address the 1.5 million versus 2.2 million as a Planning Commission recommendation as our feedback on policy LG2, as opposed to putting it in the alternatives analysis, because my intention in bringing it up was to highlight a potential inconsistency within the document that we have before us in terms of exacerbating the jobs housing balance as opposed to ameliorating the problem.
All right. Thank you.
I don't know whether that's copacetic with Ms. Jacobs, but that was my original intent, is to elevate it to the same level as Mr. White's concern over the blankety-blank height number.
All right.
And that would leave the grid for the EIR study unchanged.
I'm not even addressing that issue at this point. I was just speaking to the non-residential square footage limitation.
Language in the policy.
Right, and then I think we can deal with the EIR piece because I'm seeing well, I'll let the Commission address that last subject, but I think it should be different than the core policy question of what does the policy LG2 look like that we would like the Council to adopt as a starting point.
So, that being said, before everybody gets real excited when I put it out there, so it's 1.5 million square feet, and the question would be, are we posing 1.5 million square feet as our feedback on policy LG2? Is that correct? Okay. All those, please, in support of that.
Madam Chair. I mean, I would suggest that we're hearing Mr. Jostes is going to make that as part of his motion
Okay.
for the package.
Okay.
And,
So then I'm not going to worry about a straw vote.
That would be in our subcommittee transmittal letter.
Okay. Well, then it
Because I
sounds
think
like
staff feels that they have a realistic, they have a reasoning to support their putting in of this 2 to 2.2, but I think the commission should weigh in on the subject in its transmittal of its recommendations, separate from its overall endorsement of the package we call the Policy Preferences Report.
So we would be asking the subcommittee to put this forward.
Yes.
Correct? Okay.
Chair Larson, however, I do think a straw vote to get the reading that it's unanimous, the 6 of you, or some other combination, is in forwarding this set of proposed policies, you can do it as drafted by staff, or it's also completely okay, as we just did in that other one, for one of you to put out, would the commission consensus recommendation be that LG2 on page 28, LG2 little paragraph A, state 1 million. And that's completely okay, and then staff will explain in the council report that this was done on the part of the commission in reflecting the concerns about jobs, housing, and so forth, and then staff could explain why we had initially proposed this and posed the question. So you could make this your own, or we could leave it as is and then express your opinion. Whichever one you want is completely fine. And as far as working with the committee on these other points, I just wanted to say yes, yes, yes. I mean, it would be a very brief letter. We wholly support continuing the comprehensive plan Santa Barbara package with the land use element companion to the housing element. I don't know that we're really doing it ahead of, but together, yes, 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 working with you all on these objectives. We wanted, we put our heads together and we put some things out for you, but there will be extensive discussion, indicators, objectives, adaptive management, how does that all work together? And then your third point, on the EIR alternatives, we've got scoping meetings to come. We fully expect to work on all those things. So again, the subcommittee has done a tremendous amount of work. I don't want to make more work for them in terms of another letter and all of that, and if it's not necessary. I did want to give you the feedback that we understand those points are in complete agreement, and whatever motion you want to make regarding LG2 is fine. We're happy to forward that as well, however you'd like to handle that. I just would like a vote on it, though.
Okay.
It's a little unclear to me. I think you all ended up agreeing on the building height by general consensus. Maybe you can make some sort of indication like that on this one as well.
Okay, just a moment. Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm trying to understand, if we put it in LG2, then does that not translate at some point into our EIR alternative chart, or can we craft a straw vote to just study the range from 1 million to 3 million in the non-residential, and then we've got it.
On that point, staff is pretty clear that the environmental review range can be whatever you ask it to be. What we'd like to know is, do you want the initial package that we'll be really working on to divide up the square footage to be 1.5 or 1? All the range will be studied. Yes.
All right.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
My straw poll request would be to get to hear the Commission's preference on changing the 1.5 million reference in LG2 subparagraph A from 1.5 to 1.0 million, understanding that would amend the preferred project as listed in the alternatives portion that we will also be discussing from 1.5 of Measure E to 1.0 of Measure E and still retaining the 0.5 of non-Measure E as a part of that description. That's what I'm asking for a yay or a nay on.
Thank you. And for that, I'll call that question. All those in favor, please.
Aye.
And we have 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 in favor. So that's 4 to 2. Sure. Go ahead, Ms. Jacobs.
I am fine with changing it as part of alternative policy number 1, but to change the essence of the project after over a month of having it be this way, without the development community present, we're in a public hearing, and I don't think that it's right to whack out 500,000 square feet from the primary proposed project. So I'm not comfortable with doing that. I'm comfortable with putting it in the alternative policies, but not with making it the project.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Well, at the risk of muddling things even further, I thought we had an existing motion on the floor from Mr. White regarding do you want 60 feet or do you not want 60 feet? And I don't think we've dispensed with that. We did a lot of discussion, but I don't know that the motion has been voted or pulled.
Okay.
Did someone second that motion? I thought I tried to interrupt before that happened. So I think that motion died for lack of second by my,
Okay.
all the interrupting later discussion.
I knew my hair'd be on fire at this
Okay.
meeting. Mr.
And I'll
Bartlett?
second Mr. Joseph's motion.
Mr. Bartlett? I'm just going to go down the line. Everybody just gather it together. Mr. Bartlett?
I just wanted to concur with Commissioner Jacobs on the motion that we didn't make.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Justice.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to light my...
No apologies allowed. Oh, look, all the lights went out when I said that. It's pretty good. Okay, so let's do the 60-foot first. Commissioner Thompson, though. Oh, died for lack of a second. Oh, all right, great. I apologize. All right. So we're back to the 1.5 million. So 4 to 2. But did that have a second?
Yes, I second.
You seconded it. Okay. And is there any further discussion about it?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Justice.
I have a sufficient variety of perspectives that I heard in this discussion that I think we can include the essence of our discussion in our cover memo that respects Ms. Jacobs and Mr. Bartlett's preference to express our views but not actually change the policy because of the strong implications on not having a fully vetted change in policy. And I think I sense that that has support from the rest of the Commission to address it that way. Leave the numbers as they exist in the document, but highlight those preferences as a part of our transmittal.
Great. Now, is there a motion to gather this all up in a nice linear fashion and get it moving towards City Council? Oh,
Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Vincent.
Before we move anywhere further, I don't want any more confusion. Was that a withdrawal of the motion by the motion maker on your straw poll, on your straw vote regarding changing LG2?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Yes.
Vincent.
And in its place, you expressed what you'd like to convey in a memo, and people's heads were nodding. In place of the motion that was withdrawn, Commissioner Joseph said, I think we get the essence of what the discussion was, and we can include that in a cover memo, which I understood the essence to be as well. Looking at a smaller growth number for jobs housing, realizing that such a direction at this point could be a concern for stakeholders in the community that have not had an opportunity to respond to it at this point. an interest in seeing the full range of build out non-residential and residential. I think it all fits in with the comments you've made about looking forward to the EIR analysis and an ability to, once you have more information, select growth limits and goals with more in all of that. I think it will work perfectly in a summary statement from the Commission.
And part of my interest in withdrawing that was to ensure that we get a unanimous vote on moving this document forward and not have any second thoughts about it, so that we can articulate that we are in strong support of the document.
Yes. All right. We have a little more comment, and then let's get to where we're going. Ms. Jacobs?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a comment on what I am hoping this memo cover letter will be. I'm expecting that it's going to be a one-page summary of kind of the discussion here and not a longer discussion of what other policies might be that would be coming from us as a commission but would not be necessarily vetted by us. I think that the minutes of this meeting are the document that council will need, and for the public record, I would expect that the cover memo will certainly be distributed with the staff report and with the policies, such that when it gets to City Council, the development community and our public will have a chance to see all of that.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As with the last meeting, I have been advocating, I think that Mr. Bartlett actually raised this topic, I would say, 2 months ago, the whole notion of how this commercial square footage does, if there's too much of it, it really does violate the policies of trying to reduce the jobs housing imbalance. And last hearing, I indicated I was supportive of a 1 million square foot option, and I want to make sure that there is a memo going forward. Now that there's something gritty in it, I want to just make sure that there is a memo that's going to go forward to council. It indicates that a majority of this commission supports the 1.5 million total non-residential option. So that's where we're going? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to follow up on a comment that Commissioner White made earlier about his two topics to be dealt with, the 60-foot height and then the TEDR. We really didn't wrestle to the ground the TEDR issue that came up today really for the first time as a result of the new LG7 that was inserted into this report. And I think the point that was brought forward by Ms. Plowman, that if we lower the cap that we just did the unofficial straw vote on, that would have the same net effect as eliminating the TEDR, which has been a great tool. So if the cap goes lower, I would certainly want to keep the existing TEDR tools in place for non-residential, which is eliminate the LG7. So I'd like to have some discussion on where others are with that so that we can get it all included in the cover letter.
Comments? Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The TEDR is a large, unknown quantity of potential commercial development in this community. Staff, I know, gave it a look in the last short while, but there's a lot of square footage out there that's not part of what we're inventorying in this general plan today. I mean, beyond let's say we went to 1.5 million. There's more than that. That's the old TEDR square footage, and I'm understanding that it's in the order of hundreds of thousands of square feet. So it's not 1.5 million that we're looking at in the future. It's 1.8. It's 1.9. It's maybe 2. We don't know, and it's something that in the past it wasn't inventoried as it's gone forward, so we don't know. That was then. We just never thought that would be perhaps this kind of issue. So I feel that first of all, the number that we're going to be dealing with in terms of commercial square footage in the future is more than 1.5 because of that old TEDR. Might finally put some value into that. I mean, I've dealt in this trading or marketing of TEDRs a little bit, and it's not a big number at this point. But if there's a limitation on square footage, then maybe this old TEDR square footage starts to develop a little more value. But I'm satisfied that this can go away, and that there's still going to be plenty of square footage for those things that this community really wants to move forward. I appreciate that the vetting with the development community needs to occur. That is absolutely true. But this is at least meeting number 2 where this discussion has gone on, and I support it. And I do want it vetted, so I'll certainly look to my colleagues about how best to do that, and of course to hear what your views are. But I know that we've got, as I mentioned before, I don't want this to be a sneaky process. I want it to be very, very transparent. But I support this option of getting rid of the TEDR going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. White. Commissioner Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We did have TEDR on the table when we had our joint meeting with the City Council, so this isn't the first time that people have had a chance to talk about it. So I'm a little more comfortable with this, but I am more comfortable with it when the project is as stated, the 1.5 plus and then ending up at 2. So now we're kind of changing the ratio there between what's available for transfer. So I become less comfortable with the TEDR when the project starts to change by 500,000 square feet. So for me, there's a kind of a balance there that needs to be achieved, which is why I thought that the lesser amount of square footage belonged in the alternative policy number 1 and not in the project itself. But the vote of the Commission has been to include that as the project and to forward it to City Council with that cover letter, so the Council will be making that decision. The TEDR and commercial square footage fits in with the economic part of the city plan. Commercial revenue is part of what drives the engines that make the whole city livable. So if we start taking out more and more commercial space, then we start putting a ding in the city's coffers, and those are the coffers that are going to pay for transit, and they're going to pay for pedestrian sidewalks and access. That's part of that whole cycle of money that I'm keeping a pulse on. So the TEDR, like I said, it becomes a problem for me when we take it from when we take the project and start to change it, and I'm not quite sure what would make me feel that it's back in balance again. TEDR is something that we could put in or out of an alternative, but it's we're really putting a big dent in the city's commercial square footage with both of these changes to the program, and the development community isn't really here to talk about it, and so I'm not completely comfortable with both of those changes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Thompson?
Well, I was just going to point out that although I support keeping that LG7 in there, there will be other opportunities for people to weigh in on this. This is not the land use element, and this is not the environmental impact study yet. So there's going to be a scoping hearing, and there will be discussions on the actual verbiage in the land use element. So there will be more opportunity for this to be discussed.
Thank you very much. Sure. Ms. Jacobs?
Can we at least put it into the restore TEDR in alternative policy number 2 and study what effect that would have?
Yeah, that's good.
Is it something that we can study as a separate piece of the puzzle? Because like Mr. Thompson, there are many opportunities further down the line to discuss and fine-tune it. I don't want to belabor it here today, especially given that we're forwarding this with the cover letter.
Thank you, Commissioner Jacobs. Commissioner Bartlett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, TEDR gives us that flexible tool to put the square footage that we have in a better location that works better for the city, is less impactful traffic-wise. It's not creating new footage that we didn't already have, and it allows us to do redevelopment and really clean up what is in the past been perhaps a haphazard patchwork quilt, and now we have a chance to move parts around and make it work better for everybody. It's not creating something new that we don't have. It just gives us that option. So I would like to keep TEDR moving forward and not hamper future redevelopment efforts.
Thank you. Mr. White?
And just the flip side of that is it's one more aggravation of the jobs housing imbalance. It's one of the difficult choices that the city needs to make going forward is how do you balance those two basic elements of our community. And I feel like I've been looking for little pieces to shave the potential for aggravating this issue, and not just by building more of everything, or building more units and building more commercial and then building more units in order to feed the commercial. It's just you lose the character of Santa Barbara, and that's my worry. And this is one small way where a small bit of that imbalance can be taken off the table.
Thank you very much, Mr. White. All right. There's a light. Commissioner Justice, a motion?
Madam
perhaps?
Chair, if we're ready, I am prepared to make 2 separate motions to respond to the 2 recommendations that staff has provided on the first page of our staff report.
Thank you. Please proceed.
My first motion would be as follows: considering the quality of public input and extraordinary hard work and collaboration between the public, staff, and the Planning Commission, we recommend the City Council accept the revised policy preferences report and initiate the formal EIR process based upon the vision, goals, objectives, and policies contained therein.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson, for the second. And any discussion about this?
I just want to clarify. That involves the change that was made by consensus to the building height and no other changes to the document. So the LG7 with looking at changing no future TEDRs and the 1.5 in terms of this set, again, you can have additional comments, but is that what the motion entails?
That's correct. It does.
Okay, that was my understanding.
Commissioner Jacobs.
Under discussion, Madam Chair.
Yes.
I will support the motion, but I would like to go on record with specific concerns regarding the TEDR and the change of commercial square footage as which. Just the TEDR, because I know Mr. Justice is going to make a second motion that's probably going to be about the cover memo, or.
Yes, and.
Okay, so I would like to go on record with concerns about the TEDR.
Very well. Commissioner Bartlett?
Yes, and I have the same concern regarding TEDR before we vote, but I don't want to upset the motion.
Madam Chair, if I may ask just exactly what is the change we're making to CH10, the height limit? We're keeping the 2 bullet points, but removing the first the phrase retain the 60-foot height limit for the downtown area, comma, however. And so the 2 bullet points remain.
So the boldface
Thank you.
and the bullet points.
Yes. Thank you. All right. I'm going to do just that. All those in favor, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Second, go ahead. Number 2.
Madam Chair, I move the Planning Commission authorize the General Plan Subcommittee to draft a letter that captures the discussion of concerns as articulated by the Commissioner's comments this afternoon. Period. And I'm looking for feedback on whether the Commission as a whole wants to see that letter or not. I defer to the Commission as a whole. I would defer.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Under discussion. Mr. White?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I understand it, there was a majority, and not just, and thank goodness, a majority of the Commission as a whole, who was supporting the 1.0 plus 500 non-residential square footage. And I haven't heard in that motion any reference to that, and I'd appreciate hearing how that would be handled. Would that be articulated in that memo, Madam Chair?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Justice?
I presume that somebody might lean on me to at least draft a starting point of this memo. And yes, it would refer to the 4-2 vote expressing the Commission's preference towards the 1.0 versus 1.5, and also articulate the concerns that the folks voting in the minority had over that. And it would also include a discussion of the folks voting in the affirmative as to the basis of their support. So it would provide a range of perspectives and also acknowledge that there was in fact a 4-2 preference as a part of the straw poll.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Bartlett?
Commissioner Justice, will that include a discussion on the LG7 TEDR that we just had as well?
Yes, it would. I'm going to go back over the tape and make sure we capture the trade-offs and perspectives that were voiced as well, but do it in such a way that is concise and to the point and no more lengthy than is necessary to communicate that range of perspectives.
Thank you. And Commissioner Jacobs?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Going back to my notes, and thank you for Commissioner Justice for taking that initial draft on and for the comments that you just made, which will reflect our minority vote. Also in my notes, you were going to include an issue of sequencing the land use and housing elements, and I would like to see that in the cover memo. And the third one was identifying that objectives at a future date will be turned into an adaptive management program, or that objectives may are a work in progress within this work. But the sequencing of the land use and housing elements, I think, is important to forward along with our recommendation.
I'd be happy to cover all of those items.
And I'd like to see some lights go on with reference to Mr. Justice's inquiry as to whether or not the Commission would like to see the letter before it goes out, the memo, letter of...
Madam Chair, if there's a preference, I would suggest it be considered as a consent item so that we can dispose of it expeditiously, as opposed to have a full-fledged discussion of what we thought we might have said.
Oh, I agree.
Unless you trust the subcommittee to get it right.
Well, I'm inclined to trust the subcommittee. Let's see, we could do a straw poll on the trust of the subcommittee.
Chair Larson, I
think we're
want to
okay
give
there.
a reference in terms of timing and the drafting and whether or not this is good with the author, because the way this is going, we're headed to council on December 11th. And so we would like to get out our planned Santa Barbara report to council, which only involves striking a few numbers, like 60. This is almost good to go. And then we'll be writing a council agenda report and getting it out fairly soon. And I think you want that memo attached to the council agenda report. So you are meeting next week. And I don't know if that agenda has been finalized. But we could still produce a revised one. Well, it's tough. But the concern is that if you wait till your first meeting in December, our council agenda report's already out. So your opportunity to have it on an agenda is next week.
Mr. White?
I'm okay, Madam Chair, with the subcommittee writing the letter.
All right. I happen to be okay with that, too. And is there anyone who is not okay with that? Great. We're all in accord. Isn't that great? So, all those in favor of Mr. Joseph's motion?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, last motion
Yes.
regarding the EIR alternatives.
Yes.
I move the Planning Commission forward the basic EIR alternatives contained in Exhibit C of the staff report, with the understanding that they be constructed to respond to the need to identify a more functional approach to identifying an environmentally superior alternative, should one exist.
Second.
Very good. We have a motion by Mr. Justice, a second by Commissioner Thompson. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And all those opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Thank you very much for getting us through all this, everyone. It's a true group effort. And thank you, staff, for hanging in there. It's great. 10 days. Where would you like your stay? So now we can proceed with our administrative agenda. Committee and liaison reports. I have one. Well, we're sort of getting it together. I did attend quite a meeting of HLC regarding the El Encanto. And the Northwest Corner continues to be a big stickler. And they are scheduled to come back to us in December. But with the amount of, I don't know if that scheduling is firm or not. Let's put it that way. There's a lot on the plate. So we'll be looking for a lot of action on El Encanto soon, just so everybody knows. Anyone else? Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have an announcement. I need to leave the meeting now for a lead study group that I'd signed up for that starts at 4, so I won't be able to stay for reviewing of the minutes and the resos, and I also needed to abstain from the reso on the 600 and 800 block of Milpas.
Do you have any changes you wish to submit?
No, I don't.
In writing? Okay, thank you very much. Drive safely. And next, review of the decisions of the staff hearing officer, please.
I have nothing to report, Madam Chair.
All right, they're saving it all up for Ms. Weiss. Thank you very much. And action and review on consideration of the draft minutes of October 16th, please. Any corrections, additions, corrections, deletions? Oh, Ms. Jacobs?
For the commission meeting minutes of October 16th on page 7, in the commission comments, item 2, fourth sentence, fourth line in item 2, that the distribution of affordable units is supportable would make more sense there. That sentence kind of dead ends. So distribution of affordable units is supportable. And And then similar issue on item 4, line 2, and into line 3. I would change that to they advocated for active use of the common space area by residents. And then when we get into the discussion in item 9 of the fire lane, I want to make sure that we're not making it sound like we're expecting a fire lane to be turned into a pocket park. So it would read in item 9 that the commission generally liked the use of the extra space abutting the fire lane area. And using the same language in item 10, line 2, what goes into the extra space abutting the fire lane area. And then on page 8, item 15, Item 15, the second line, is water catch system the appropriate term there? Or is it water catchment? Is water catch? I can't remember which commissioner said that, but usually it's a different word. It's water retention system. Yeah, thank you. And then in the motion, I don't know if this is verbatim, but for item 4, that the applicant will install landscaping into the southern portion of an existing fire lane. I think we need to, again, just note that that is extra space in the existing fire lane. And that the applicant, in item 4 it would read, the applicant will consult with the fire department to create, the applicant will install landscaping into the southern portion of extra space in an existing fire lane and will create, in consultation with the fire department, usable open space, so that the fire department doesn't get left out of the discussion of what they need to maintain fire access to the property. And that's all.
Thank you very much. Any others? All right, all those in favor, or
Move approval of the minutes as revised.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we come to resolutions. Resolution number 037-08, the 6 to 800 block of Milpa Street. Oh, I'm sorry. I jumped the gun. Okay.
My motion was intended to cover the minutes.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I'll just read them in then. Okay. Thanks. Resolution 0038-08, 15 South Hope. All right, thanks very much. And we're adjourned. Thank you very much.